All right, welcome back to Shoot Me Straight with Eddie and Dave. Today is going to be a good interview. We have our very first special needs guest. We'll see how he does. Sean Gallagher, my little brother.
Special needs. Best introduction ever.
Just give it your best shot, buddy. No, man, welcome to the show. This has been a long time coming. I know we've tried to make this happen before, and due to illnesses and sicknesses with having three boys, you fought that battle earlier and won. So we got you down here finally.
Yeah, I don't have the bubonic plague at this moment, which is good.
Yeah.
This will be the first time. I was just saying, this will be the first time we've been on camera together in like 5 years, which is nuts. Yeah.
Oh, because we were on the Fox interview with Pete Hegseth.
That was like immediately post trial, and then you still had like your sentencing or whatever, all the other BS that was going on.
Yeah.
And that was funny because Andrea and I were on TV a bunch, and then I was just like, oh, now Eddie's here. He can do the talking.
Yeah, the last person that should be doing the talking. So I mean, for the listeners, obviously people have heard me talk about my brother, and my wife, Andrea, gets a ton of credit, which she should. But my brother was right there alongside her, fighting tooth and nail to get me out of prison. So I couldn't ask for a better younger brother. I love you, and I'm so glad that you're on here. So I know you wanted to come on. You had some kind of plan. I don't know what it is, but I'll let you get started.
Just to see if the listeners can figure out that Eddie and I are pretty much night and day when it comes to personalities and characteristics. We've always been quite different people.
Even growing up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Eddie and I are... Well, we were talking about this last night. Like, family, like, core fundamental values, all of that stuff. Like, we're very passionate about the same things. But in just terms of, like, affect, like, I've always been very outgoing. Like we were talking about this, like, agreeableness, all of that stuff, where Eddie has always just been, like... It's really funny because my wife exhibits a lot of the same characteristics. Like, Ed's personality trait is that there's almost, like, a brutal honesty where, like, you never don't know how Ed feels. Like,
it's written on my face.
Yeah. Even if he's just like, yeah, I'm good. You're like, no, I don't think you are. But like, I've always been very much the opposite. Like, just being like, oh yeah, get along to go along. But we had that growing up, which was interesting. But yeah, we had an interesting childhood because we were moving around all the time and going from place to place, which was
definitely an interesting childhood. I mean, I guess that'd be the first question. How would you describe our childhood to people?
Unique. This is always, we always say, like, how do you answer when people say, where are you from? Like, that's one question that Ed and I were always like, well, how much time do you have? Because, like, the irony being, I live 10 minutes from where I was born now, which is interesting because, like, I was born at Bethesda Naval. Now it's Walter Reed, but I was born there, and then we moved to China. So that was like 2 years when I was 1. I don't really remember much of that at all, but we have a bunch of photos and all that stuff when we were in China. And then it was like 2 years there. We go back to Virginia. Our dad works at the Pentagon. It's 2 years there. I go to kindergarten, first grade in Virginia. And then we go back to Korea. So he had been there early in his career. We go to Korea for 2 to 3 years. Now that I remember, like, I think you and I both really, really liked that.
Oh yeah, that was a good time.
Yeah, we were stationed in Seoul. And the base no longer exists where we were. It was bracked. It was closed. But
it's called Yongsan.
Yeah.
Was the base.
Yeah. And it was essentially, I described to people like that was Central Park. Like, we were in Seoul, like, in the city, like, in the middle of it. And it was, like, so 80s, 90s, where it was just, like, a gate that surrounded it. And, like, we were allowed as, like, a third grader and a seventh grader. We were just, like... The MPs at the gate were like, oh, you guys want to walk into the city? And we were just like, all right, see ya. And, like, we would, like, go into downtown Seoul, like, hang out, get candy, do whatever.
Get caught shoplifting.
Get caught. Maybe not paying for some candy.
Sprinting for your life back to the gate so we don't get caned.
We would make it back in. And it was interesting because, like, that was considered, like, American soil. It was, like, this very unique thing. Like, you lived on an American compound. But it was, like, so normal to us. Like, there was we lived kind of across the street from an armory. I remember Dad taking me to the armory and, like, showing me all the stuff and doing all that stuff. And the irony also is that Dad was at that point in his career, like the head of the police. So he was like the head of the military police, which was funny for Ed, because Ed was getting into trouble all the time. And there's like these like just hilarious stories of Ed being like, "Oh, Dad like trying to discipline him," and then you're like, "I'm gonna go call the cops," and Dad's like, I am the cops. Like you can't like appeal to a higher authority. This is it." And like funny things like that. And then when Dad retired, we ended up going to. I mean, I still consider myself a little bit like Midwestern, like especially because I was a little younger. So we get out. That's like third, fourth grade. We go back to Virginia. Dad then gets a gig out in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So when I was in fifth grade, we moved out to the Midwest, which was actually probably the biggest. I would say that was the biggest culture shock for me. We had lived in all over the United States, like Norfolk, Virginia, all that stuff, and then China, Korea, and then we end up in the Midwest.
In Indiana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was there from fifth grade to high school, and then moved away and never came back. I graduated, and then went to college outside Philadelphia, like in the suburbs at Villanova, and then graduated there. Spent about a year in New York City. Thought I was going to be a lawyer. Thank God. Decided that was not the path for me. I had a pretty smart professor in college that knew I was going down that path and was just like, "Hey man, I was a lawyer. It was awful. Why don't you be a paralegal? Like go work at a law firm before you take out loans and do all that stuff." And I was like, "Okay, that sounds like a practical idea." Worked at a mega law firm like downtown Manhattan, which was a really like.
Is that when you lived in that little apartment?
Yeah.
Up in is that near Times Square?
Yeah, so we lived at 54th and 7th, which is about 5 blocks north of Times Square. Eddie visited. We had some good visits when you visited out there. But it was awesome. It was 2005, 2006. So it's like social media wasn't a thing yet really. And it was like old school New York. So like we were just meeting people at bars, meeting people out. And it was me and 3 of my college buddies. So like we all were just entering the workforce, trying to figure out what we wanted to do with our lives. Like the one buddy that lived with me there is still the only one that still has the same job. Like essentially he works at the same place, but everybody else has like tried different things. Like one of my buddies was an engineer and then became a lawyer. One was in finance. Like we were all just trying to figure out what we wanted to do with our lives, but we were like going out 3-4 nights a week, like just drinking in New York. Like New York was
literally drinking in New York.
Yeah, spent all my money on essentially rent and beer.
Yeah.
But we lived in the most hilarious like clown car apartment that was definitely owned by the Russian mob. Like we had this like hilarious story where all of us, you have these brokers to try and get apartments. Like they always say, "Oh, no broker fee to try and get you in to rent an apartment." And it was this like Ukrainian or Russian lady. And then like when we had to give our deposit, we all met in the basement of this like dingy New York building. And all of us like tried to dress up to be like, "Oh, we're responsible. Like we're gonna be good tenants." And then we all have cash on us. We all have like $2,000-3,000 each on our person because we had to give like first and second month rent and all this stuff. And it was like the Russian mob. Like the Russian mob owned the place. We were just like, I remember being in that room, like your spidey sense goes off. I was like, "Oh shit, this is a really dumb idea. Like what are we doing?" But we lived in this like 1-bedroom. It's such a New York story. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that was like straight up spliced into 4. Like we put up like paper mache walls. Like one of my buddy's rooms was just a queen size bed. And you couldn't open the door into it. You had to, like, that's how small it was. You had to open it out. But we all paid like $1,000 a month in rent. But it was a really fun time.
I had a blast when I came down there and visited. It was like for a couple of days.
Yeah. There's this great story that all my buddies, like everybody knew I grew up in a military family. Everybody knew that Eddie was a SEAL at that point because this was 2006-07. And he visited with George. You had this
George Wilcox, the British SEAL.
Dude, like the best thing ever. Eddie visits, and he brings this Navy SEAL with him, who is this most mild-mannered British guy. Like the last thing you expect, because most SEALs are like really, it's what you expect. They're like gristled and a little rough around the edges, understandably so. But George was like very mild-mannered, and he was British, and everyone was like, "What?" But yeah, the funny story is that we all went drinking, and you guys were. You guys going to 18 Delta at that time?
We were at this special operations medical course. Yeah.
So they came with a bag, like a literal like athletic huge duffel bag of just IVs, of saline IVs.
Those LR,
Yeah.
lactated ringers, yeah.
Yeah. So we all get drunk, we hang out, we do the thing, and then the next morning we're all hungover, and Ed and George are just taping IVs like to the wall and like sticking them. But you guys had missed each other, like you had missed your veins. So it was like a bunch of bloody arms, and you guys were just sitting there hanging out. And all my buddies are like, they came into my room, they're like, hey, Sean, hey, your brother and his buddy, can you come take a look at what they're doing? And like I came out and you guys were just like, what's up? And it's like, they just had stuck themselves like they're like, you're
Heck
like,
yeah.
we're rehydrating.
Rehydrating for the day.
Yeah. And it was like the smartest idea ever. But that was funny. That was a good time. And then, yeah, so I spent about a year in New York, and then I realized that like New York is all about finance and like making money, and it just didn't sit with me. I didn't feel like that was my purpose. Like I liked it. I liked the experience, but in terms of like what I wanted to lend like a career towards, and like, you know, our dad was military, our mom was a teacher, like everybody did public service. Like that was kind of ingrained into us. And so at that point I was like, what do I want to do? And I had studied political science as an undergrad, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll move to DC. And so like I switched offices pretty much. The same law firm I worked at in New York had an office in DC. So I just pretty much transferred and immediately knew. And I did like the most old school story ever, where I was just like, all right, I want to get involved in pretty much policy. And I went and knocked on, at lunch hour for like 6 months straight, I just metroed to the Hill and like knocked on doors, handed out a resume, and was just like, would love to work. I interviewed probably with like 10 different congressional offices about, you know, and I tried to learn, like, what do you guys do? How does this work? And I was pretty naive. I interviewed with everybody. I interviewed Republicans, Democrats. I had no idea what I was doing. And then the dude that represented my college hometown of Villanova, so like Delaware County, Montgomery County, Philadelphia, had just got elected. He was a 3-star admiral. And so he was like, hey, do you want to help me out with some military issues and all that stuff? And I was like, sure. And so I ended up working House of Representatives. And then, so 2007, I started there, and then worked for pretty much 5 different members of Congress over about an 8-year period, just bouncing around. I ended up working for Virginia. So I started out in Pennsylvania, just northwest suburbs of Philly, and then did, the second one I moved to was like just outside San Francisco, Silicon Valley area, represented a district out there, bumped to mid-state New York. So actually, funny stories about, we represented West Point, so military academy.
Yeah.
And because we did that, I was on the board of advisors. Like the congressman I worked for was literally like on the board of advisors for West Point. I remember going to some meetings, and Dad, you know, our dad was a West Point grad, so he was like stoked. He was like, "This is awesome," and I was like, "I have no idea what I'm doing. Why am I here?" So I was New York, and then went to Virginia, represented Norfolk all the way down to North Carolina, and then the Eastern Shore, and then the last guy I worked for was New Jersey, almost equidistant between Philadelphia and New York. So like Princeton, kind of like the nice suburb area of Jersey.
Yeah. Did you enjoy that work?
Yeah. I mean, it's very, very purpose driven. So Congress, I mean, there's a lot of people who give shit Congress, and I can unpack Congress, you know, working there. But the thing is, you can make, like, if you don't want to be there, you're not going to be there for that long. The pay is awful. You're a public servant, and it's super long hours, but you get to like genuinely help people. So I started off as what they call a correspondent or a letter writer. So like if you write your congressman, or if you tweet your congressman, or if you fax your congressman, because people still do that, there's staff who intake that, read it, process it. They kind of code and batch it to say, oh, you wrote about the environment, or you wrote about the military, or you wrote about, you know, whatever it might be, Russia and Ukraine, or Israel, Palestine, or you wrote about, you know, your local HOA is, you know, sucking. You would like try but that's how you learn. It was the best education I ever got, because like Congress, I always say, it deals with everything under the sun. Congress is essentially the customer service agency of the country. So like if you have a problem and you want somebody to address it, they don't always do a good job. Most of the time they do a bad job. But as a staff, you're like trying to intake all of it. And if you have like a good faith attitude about, well, I can genuinely help somebody, like most members of Congress get there and they don't realize how little impact they're going to have. You're one of 435 in the House.
Yeah.
And most have been there for 20 years, and they literally do not give a shit about you. They don't even know your name. Like sometimes it's kind of the striking thing. I always say that I worked for 2 or 3 freshman members and then 2 or 3 senior members. So like freshmen, it's a pretty big ego boost, right? You get 200 to 300,000 people to like cast a ballot for you, like your name's on it. You campaigned, you said, hey, I want to do X, Y, Z. And you know, when you campaign, you make a bunch of promises. We're going to reduce the deficit. We're going to pull out of Afghanistan. We're going to do all of this stuff. Like you make these platitudes. And then you get there and then you're like, all right, I want to do all these things. And you realize that like nobody else, they're like, hey, great, buddy. I've been here 15 years. Like I have so much things that I've been trying to do. And then you realize that like our government isn't, one of the lessons I always tell people is that by design, the government isn't, like the way that Congress is set up is not to get stuff done on purpose. I always say, because people are always like, why is it so dysfunctional and all this stuff? And there's a lot to unpack about why it is. And it, you know, you can spend hours and hours talking about it, but you kind of forget that the founders set it up so that it would be extremely hard to do
make
stuff.
changes.
Yeah. And the reason they did that, I always say that the phrase I usually use is that government was set up not so that good bills would pass. It's so that bad bills wouldn't pass. So like every year, 10,000 bills are introduced and about 400 get passed and about 200 of those are actually substantive. About 200 to 300 are just meaningless. They're naming a post office or they're like doing some administrative thing. It's about like a 1 to 150, and even that's a stretch, are actual like appropriations bills that fund the Department of Defense or the National Science Foundation or like the Department of Interior.
Let me ask you this. When you were there and they were passing bills, were they pulling the same BS that they do now where they will throw in, hey, like the border bill that the Biden administration tried to pass, right? And they're blaming the Republicans, but the Republicans didn't sign off on it because what was attached to that bill was also 1 point whatever million going to Ukraine. Were they doing that back then too, like hiding things?
So, yes, this is actually, if you almost like take a nonpartisan like, and you step out, a retrospective look at one of the newer things, and by newer I mean 10 to 20, maybe 30 years old in congressional history, there's a calendar to Congress. So every year during the summer, like right now we're talking, it's June. This is called appropriation season. I would say that the two main things that Congress is supposed to do is fund things and pass laws, and it doesn't pass laws. So its main purpose, everybody in the House knows appropriations is like the main thing, the power of the purse, it's in the Constitution. In doing appropriations, it's really important work. Like how do you fund the military? How do you fund, you know, our State Department? How do you fund, like there's, you know, these 12 appropriations bills that deal with everything. It used to be like 70s, 60s, into the 80s, committee chairmen who were in charge of that. So if you were the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee or if you were the chairman of like Energy and Commerce, or Ways and Means, which does taxation, you had actually a lot of power. And you would have to like, there was this jockeying of, all right, Eddie is the chairman of Ways and Means. If I ever want to do anything taxation, I have to get your blessing and I have to like work with you. The big changes, and this is what everybody sees, and that's why they're pissed off at what they call omnibus or minibus, or these massive bills come together. The chairmen of the committees have been neutered. All the power now is shoved towards leadership. So Speaker McCarthy or Speaker Pelosi or whoever it was, Pelosi is, and she will admit this, and there's been a lot of conversation about this, the new age of Congress is that the individual chairmen are now less powerful. All of the power now resides in leadership. Because even though like right now, again, we're in appropriation season and we're passing these individual bills, everybody knows that come like the fiscal year of Congress is October to October. And by October, you're supposed to have funded the government. We haven't done that in 25, 30 years. There's been no regular order. So basically what happens is that at the end of the year, we're like, okay, we're going to shut down. And every year we have this stupid crisis. I mean, how many times have you guys heard, oh my gosh, the government's about to shut down, we're about to shut down. So they use like a fabricated crisis. And then they say, okay, well, we need to fund the border. And in order to fund the border, we have this massive, what they call an omnibus bill. It's a border bill with, you know, like what they call riders or cultural stuff. So they just add shit onto it. And everybody hates that. Democrats hate it. Republicans hate it.
Then why do they do it?
It's power. So like leadership, when they have it, well, okay, so you could say good faith, bad faith. Good faith is that they can't get together. There's dysfunction. They can't agree. And again, Congress is set up to be this like wholly uncooperative. Imagine there's 435 different people from all over the country that have extreme liberal, extreme conservative, You're supposed to get together, hash out your differences. And actually, I use the SEAL phrase all the time. Like in Congress, it's simple. It pays to be a winner. Like it's a winner-take-all thing. So if you're controlling the part, like if you're a Republican and you control the House, you're supposed to dictate. And like being in the minority in Congress sucks. You can't do anything. But now with this weird, like, they have a 5-4-3 functional majority in the House. We're in a very unique time. But I mean, in essence, these big bills that get put together, people are frustrated by it because there's no longer individual tweaking and input. Like you're supposed to just do an energy bill. And then you're supposed to be like, all right, we work out the kinks and differences in the energy bill. We bring it to the floor, we hash out differences, and then you got to send it to the Senate. And the Senate's got to do the same thing. And the Senate has their individual members in their committees. They're supposed to reconcile the differences. And then you got to send it to the president. And then the president has to sign off. So like it has to be all of these different inputs. Now they just say, okay, we can't get that done. It's too partisan. We're going to put veterans benefits with, like food stamps. And we're going to put it all together. We're going to have all the controversies. And we're going to say, if you don't vote for it, you shut down the government. And we're going to try and blame you. And it's this finger pointing game. The difference in Congress now, which is really cool, is that individual members no longer are threatened by that. So like, I know a lot of people, riff on Matt Gaetz, and we're like next to his district. But I can tell you behind the scenes, the changes when Speaker McCarthy was ousted or when that whole drama when they were trying to elect him, a lot of the proposals that he put forward, and there was like a gaggle, Ralph Norman was part of it, a couple others, behind the scenes, a lot of members on the left agreed with it because it started to take power away from leadership and put it back into individual members' hands. Now, they could only do that because they had a slim majority, meaning that you needed the 5, 6, 7 people who were usually on the fringes that you could just overpower by brute majority. They were then given this leverage. And in that leverage, they were like, I want these demands. I want you to do it, or you don't have my support. And because they had like 7 people as a majority, they had to listen to them. And so it was an attempt to take it away. But we're still doing the same thing. Like this year, because it's an election year, Congress is not going to reach their thing. It's going to go to October. We're going to have a shutdown. And they're going to be like, all right, well, we're just going to do what's called a CR, which is called a continuing resolution. You just literally say, we couldn't get it done, fund the government at last year's numbers. And you just continue that. But the bad thing about that is there's no planning. You can't do anything new. And Congress is supposed to be the institution that like hears from you guys and says, all right, well, we need to do a new military base or a new manufacturing facility or a new policy. But you can't do that with CRs. It just is a continuation of last year's numbers. The only benefit to that if you're a conservative is that it spends less. So there's a silver lining in that. But even fiscal conservatives don't like it too because you can't plan. You're supposed to, like, if you want to gut an entire agency, you can't because you funded at last year's levels. But yeah, so Congress is, I mean, it's interesting from an insider's perspective. It's really complicated. My experience there, it's like anything. When I got out after my 8 years, I was like pretty beat up and cynical because I was just like, fuck this place. But if you're there, I mean,
But you love it.
Well, no, it's like
yes, you do, dude.
To me, I'm an optimist. Like I'm still like, Eddie will say this about me and my personality. Like when I was a kid, I was like a golden retriever. I was just like, oh, we can do it. Like, this is great. And like when you're there, you can make a difference. Like with your trial, like it took a lot of manpower, but
yeah,
there were a couple individuals that were willing to stick their necks out and be like, all right, yeah, this is wrong. And we're going to work towards it. And like to this day, like you couldn't convince me that Ralph Norman is not like a literal answer to a prayer. Like that guy, I can delve into the story, but like he gave me a call out of the blue and was just like, hey, I'm Ralph Norman. And I didn't, I'd worked in Congress for 8 years. I didn't know who he was. I always admit this to him. I was like, are you a retired member? And I was Googling him as he was calling me. And I was like, oh shit, you're here. Like you represent South Carolina. Hey, and I would like talk to him. But like long story short, he with Duncan Hunter and a couple other people formed a coalition. We just started hammering on people, tried to make this external influence and like shine a spotlight on what was going on. And look,
You're talking about in Eddie's trial?
Yeah, in Eddie's trial. And it's just a microcosm. Like you can get, if you work hard enough at it and all that stuff, it shouldn't be that hard. But you can still, the levers of power still are responsive in some small sense to constituent input and to change. And now we live in a weird world. Like this is a really dynamic social media has really upended like everything. So I just say like in a congressional office, there are 10 staff in DC. There's like a chief, it's very hierarchical, it's like military. It's like chief of staff, legislative director, there's like a press secretary. Social media has changed the DNA of Congress. There are now more staff that do social media and what they call like press.
Yeah. Well, when we were visiting Congress the last time we were there trying to get people to sign off on the caucus, right? Yeah, I remember going to different congressmen and women's offices, and it's like they have a social media studio in their office, like, and that's what they just sit there and do social media all day.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, again, Congress has an approval rating of like, the joke is it has an approval rating of like 4 or 5%, and that's just family who feels bad for them. That's the joke. It's like, who's approving of Congress, right? And the irony is that the re-elect rate in Congress is like 90%. So individual members get reelected at a clip of like 90 to 92%. So like Congress is an institution.
Do you think there should be term limits?
I struggle on that question, like honestly.
Because I mean, everybody is always shouting to have term limits.
Yeah.
Like they want it. But I mean, is there a con to having term limits?
Yeah. So essentially, the argument against that is elections. Like you can vote out whoever you want at a 2-year period. That's a term limit. Like,
yeah, but I think you can't vote out whoever you want because I think there are certain, well, not certain, a lot of congressmen and women that get in there, and then it's about the money and the power.
Yep.
You take like Dan Crenshaw, for example. Like that guy is sitting there. He has sold his soul and is making money. Mm-hmm. Whether you want to call it legally, it's morally wrong what he's doing, but he has the power in there to, like, his seat's not going to get taken.
So yeah, this is
so even because I talk to some people and they're like, it doesn't even matter once you're in, like, you're not getting voted. Even if people want you out, you ain't getting out.
Yeah. So this is part of the 90%, right? So 90% are reelected. The easy way to understand that is that certain districts, like where we live, like where you live here, it's a very conservative Republican district. So the argument about term limits is like, okay, so say you set six years. That's 3 terms for a member of the House. That's 1 term for the Senate. If you set term limits, does the person that come in, are they any different? This is a conservative area. Typically, you're going to have the same types of values and politics as the next person. However, it is a change of personnel. So maybe it's a huge difference. Maybe it isn't. So in essence, like think of like Nancy Pelosi's district. Right? If whoever follows her, is it going to be that different? Probably not. So does that change fundamentally? The thing about
we wouldn't know if we didn't give it that chance.
So yeah, that's a good argument.
That's it's that argument being like, oh, it doesn't make a difference because it'll be the same type of individual coming in is bullshit. It's like you don't know that. No one knows that for sure.
Yeah.
There should be term limits, I think. I mean,
yeah, so
I don't think someone like Nancy Pelosi should be. I mean, but look, she's not even the only one. Like, look at Joe Biden. Look at all these people who have spent their entire adult career in politics, sucking the money out of every person, out of this country. And they don't go, like, they're corrupt. They have, like I said, sold their soul early on. So there's no benefit to them to doing the right thing. Everything's about me, and I think that's because they don't have term limits because they get comfortable in there and they're like, dude, I'm going to make a lifestyle out of this. And the purpose of going into politics is to help the American people, right? Is to help this country, and I think that's lost because there's no term limits because they're like, what are you going to do? I ain't going anywhere.
Yeah, power is corrupting, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Everything you said is correct. I always try and give people a holistic perspective because term limits is a great idea. I think that it would fundamentally change things. But I think also there's a possibility it wouldn't change anything at all. Like I always try and give people like a historical perspective of like, okay, well, what happens if that goes through? And then I always try to tell people, yes, you were correct, and like you look at Congress now and its state and its operations, and you're like, dude, it's messed up. Like
it's a clown show.
Yeah, and you're like, well, clearly something happens. But one of the arguments I always give people, I'm like, you have the capability to change it right now. Like if you're going to wait for term limits, you're going to wait forever. They're never going to do it. Like, that's just my thing. Like, if you did term limits, I think the mechanism is you would need to change the Constitution. Well, to change the Constitution, you need a supermajority in Congress, and then you need to send it to all the states, all the state bodies.
And the game they play is because both of them will be like, okay, yeah, we agree on term limits, but the Republicans will vote for term limits when they have no say in the House. So they know that will go nowhere. The Democrats do the same thing, and they sit there and promise the American people, like, "Oh yeah, we're going to get term limits," knowing full well that it's never going to pass.
My whole thing is to, I get people two perspectives on Congress. That, like, there is a lot of good that still gets done, and of course no one loves hearing that. But like when I was there, like, you can truly help. So, for instance, there's corners of the office that just do casework, and basically a congressional office. One of the more like fulfilling things that you can do, which is what I did when you handle like Veterans Affairs, is the VA is, as we all know, like super fucked up. So like you can call your congressman and be like, hey, my case isn't being heard. And then Congress is the oversight body. So they call the VA and they're like, hey, Dave's benefits package is, lost in the wind. I need you to fix it. So you can, exert oversight and all that stuff. So there's some good that you can do there. And there's some like oversight mechanisms behind the scenes that gets no press. So everybody knows what you see in the news is just the shiny red ball, right? Polarization sells, extremism sells. That's what we see. There is a lot behind the scenes, and I'm not defending Congress wholesale. I'm just like, part of it is still working. Part of it, there's still good faith people there that are doing a lot. Fundamental changes are big things is term limits, but two, my whole thing is money. I am wholesale, like full stop, campaign finance. Like there should be, if you want to donate $100 to your candidate, fine, as an individual, if you want to do that. My whole thing is PACs. PACs rule the day now is corporations left and right are donating millions, if not billions. And that is what now where the power broker is. Like if you got rid of that, you change the game. Like term limits, I think wouldn't have as big of an impact as campaign finance. And campaign finance is one of those things both parties are complicit. Like they both suck at the teat. And like the cool thing is when I watch presidential candidates now, like Vivek Ramaswamy talked about this a ton. Because as you're running, he's like, oh, wait a minute, why am I not getting access and press time and all this stuff? And all of these people soon to realize, like, why the donors favor this person? Oh, well, they're doing their bidding. And the more money you get, the more campaign staff you get, the more airtime you get. Like, it's just a way, it's fundamentally undemocratic. Because it should be one person, one vote.
That's called corruption.
Yeah, it's
there's a word for it.
As the fancy one that they use is quid pro quo. Like I have numerous examples of being a congressional staff, getting visited by a lobbyist. The lobbyist didn't get the answer they wanted, and then donated to the campaign of the person I was working, and that person changed their mind. Mm-hmm. And I was just like in Congress, being like, "This is as bad as it gets."
Yeah. What was that? So when you go into you were pursuing law, mm-hmm. and you're like, you know what, I'm gonna pivot over into politics, and you get there, you spend those 6 months, door knocking, you're like ambitious, green, mm-hmm. Idealistic probably, and then you get in there, and what was that process like over those 8 years of just like, oh my gosh, is this how it really works?
Yeah. I mean, there's.
You seem real reasonable and level, like.
Yeah, there's like if you were to talk to me the year I got out, like like I got engaged my last year there, and I was just like, I'm not raising a family around this. They don't pay enough. The hours are crazy, and also like you reach a point where you're like, what the fuck am I doing? Like, am I making any difference? This place seems to be stuck in the mud, and you're like, can I make a difference? That, but I've softened on that over the years because when you're in there, it's actually, if you're a good person, like if you're there as a good person, you want to make a difference, it can be emotionally taxing because all you're doing is talking to people that need help day in and day out. Maybe there's someone that's going to get deported that shouldn't. Maybe there's someone that didn't get deported that should. And if you talk to a family about that, like that's life and death situation, and you're doing that on a day-to-day basis. There's veterans that need help. There's, and there's also hilarious issues where you deal with, I would say, the first story I dealt with was just absolutely like bonkers. Like I get into an office, and this admiral I worked for, the airport, the Federal Aviation Administration had just done a redesign of where the planes were flying. So all of a sudden a bunch of nice suburban houses had planes flying over, and they hated it because it was noise pollution and it lowered their property value. They were calling our office, screaming at us, like, fix this, like, this is blah, blah, blah. And so the congressman looked at me and was like, fix it. And I was like, fix the airspace? You want me to fix the what? And he was like, yeah, figure it out. And like, you're like, oh. And that's the beauty of it in a sense where like, I was so, green and new. And like, you're like, okay, so I delved into fucking FAA policy. And I was like, okay, well, what goes into an airspace redesign? And you start to realize like, okay, and there wasn't a lot of solutions we could do. It was baked. Like
I figured that. I'm like, what do you, yeah, did you end up fixing it or
you
no?
can, so this is also like cynical tactics. You can gum up the works. You can be like, oh, now I want the Government Accountability Office to do a pollution study about this new line. And so like, can I figure out another way? This is where you guys probably heard a lot of debate about the Endangered Species Act. Like they passed this law to protect like animals. So it was a good faith, good intention law to be like, oh, there's a lot of species that are dying out. That law is abused more than anything else because we're like, you don't want a housing project built. You found like the brown-headed swallow who is endangered, and you can't build here now. And like people are like, what? And so there's an abuse of, and that again is why Congress was built so that stuff didn't get passed. Is like the main premise was like first do no harm. Like we're gonna make this as hard as possible so that it needs to be a super consensus. Like the Eddie Gallaghers of the world and others that completely disagree with each other must come together. But because of that polarization now, the Eddie Gallaghers of the world and anybody that's on the opposite end of the spectrum are kicked to the side. Leadership takes most of that power. And then they wholesale force you to vote for things that, because you're like, all right, my option is either I vote no and the government shuts down because my vote is a no, or my vote is yes and it's all of this BS that I don't want. And that's where things get awful. And frankly, people use the term the swamp or permanent Washington or, professional managerial class or whatever term it exists. Like they love it because they get what they want. They stick all the stuff in there. They pray for like confusion and big bills because individually, if you shone a light on just that one thing, it would never pass. So they get to stick it in there. But yeah, sorry, I strayed. Like to answer your question, like Congress, I'm still like the optimist. Like it's our government. Like this is our country. Like you can make a difference. Like you can do it. I refuse to give up and be like, oh, it's just awful. Because the moment you do that, you then just cede them more power. Like the cynicism breeds corruption and greed. Because if you just kick back and be like, oh, it's awful, we can't fix it. They love that because then they get more power.
Yeah.
And then they get more people to do their bidding because you're no longer chirping from the outside. And it sucks because it should be, the whole thing is that like federal government should have the least power possible. Like it should be libertarian at that point. Like that's the way it was set up. Like if you go back, not to get too wonky, but like I went to graduate school.
Oh, get wonky.
Let's get
already
wonky.
are.
Let's get nerdy. Like I went to Georgetown at night when I was on the Hill to get a master's degree in policy. And it was like this awesome thing because I was practicing it during the day and at night I would be taught like academically about it. But like I took an entire class on the Federalist Papers. And like if you ever want to understand how we work, read the Federalist Papers. It's a piece of propaganda. Like it's this brilliant, it was written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Madison. I think there's three authors. They all went under a pseudonym. But anyways, it was our original form of government. 13 colonies had like this very helter-skelter. Like Virginia was its own government, New York was its own government, and we like really didn't work together. They had to sell the idea of a federal government. Like they had to sell the idea of ceding power so that we all got together to form a military and to have a uniform tax code and a uniform currency. They didn't want to do it. People were like, no, because back then they were fiercely independent. And they were like, I don't want to give you my power. Like anything I give to you lessens my rights. And so it was this big clash. But the Federalist Papers laid out the case for federal government, but very, very limited. And we have strayed from that. The whole thing about like, once they get power, they don't let it go. They either don't let it go or you have to take it back by force. And that's where the danger comes in. But I still stay to this day, like social media, again, there's a lot of bads to it. But the reason that the DNA of Congress has changed, the reason that staff now all do that is because you can just bypass the gatekeepers. You can just tweet. It's the same thing with like airlines or anything else like that. Like instead of having to call customer service and be like, you know, kicked me off this plane and all that stuff. You can just tweet, take a video and post it, and you can just shame them and be like, look what you're doing. And they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. That would have taken weeks, you know, in the previous life. Now you can just be like, what are you doing? And social media has changed that for Congress. Like it is, there's a lot of bad to it, you know, the polarization and all that stuff, but there's a lot of good to it. Like you can have access now and staff are paying attention.
You're saying the good to it is giving some more of the power back to the people in that sense. Than
Yeah.
being able to
Yeah, because
not get blocked.
Well, the people have influence now because they can, like you said, post videos,
Yeah.
you know, do whatever, shame them into doing what they want.
yeah, it's a way of, again, I always say, I use the word gatekeeper. It's people in power, and then there are rings around it. And usually those rings are all in cahoots, right? So like the press. If you talk to the Gallagher family about what we feel about the press, like just anger and absolute resentment and, you know, dealing with them, you're just like, oh my God, like this whole thing about, oh, they're the fourth institution and our fourth estate, and people talk about them like, oh, the need of the press. Like if you get an up close personal expose, like during,
I think people have that figured out.
yeah,
I mean,
but
if you're watching,
yeah,
I would say if you're watching the news now, whether you watch Fox or CNN and you're believing what you hear, you're an idiot. Like there's no hope for you. Just same thing if you're still reading New York Times as like a news source, you're a moron. Like you still have not figured out that these people, it's all lies.
yeah,
It's all an agenda and a narrative. And there might be slivers of truth, but they print it or talk about it in a way that it's either driving fear, anxiety, or whatever into their listener.
Yeah.
And to get you to do what they want. It's
worse.
it's garbage.
Well, it's worse than people think. Like,
yeah, it's way worse.
it's like when we dealt with it, like there was hardly anything. Not hardly anything. There was a lot from the military that made me like my blood boil. But then like talking to New York Times reporters about what they were going to write, and like I was talking to them like, dude, this is straight up. Well, you know this is wrong. And they're like, I don't care. Like if you meet them in person, you're like, oh my, like a villain character. It's 10 times worse than people think, and it's almost so bad that when I talk to people who they don't want to believe it, because in order to believe that, you really have like the veneer comes down. And a lot of the goodness you thought about the world, it's almost, you know, people don't want to do it because it's so uncomfortable that things that you think, you know, yeah, I think the media is bad, but like you have no idea, like when you meet them and how they operate and what they do, and just the straight up narrative driven,
Lies.
dude, like lies is such a nice word. Like, but anyways, I can get going on that. But my whole thing about the rings is social media, for all its ills, right? You know, the things that it's doing to kids and all that stuff. But one of the reasons that the powers that be hate it, and they talk about mis and disinformation and all of that stuff, the reason they do that is that they're losing power. The more that podcasts and the more that, you know, Twitter and all that stuff, like people just being like, well, what about this? And no longer do you have to go through a gatekeeper. No longer do you have to go through an institution, right? The less they have, the more you have. And the transparency, you know, they always say, that's the oldest phrase in the book, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that we really are living in a very dynamic, interesting time. Congress is responsive to
Do you
that.
see some good in this time in the last like 4 years of like that people's eyes are being opened?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, look, there's the famous phrase of, there was a cartoon, I think in 2008 or 9, I loved it, and I talk about it all the time. It says, who wants to change? Or no, it said, who wants change? And everybody raises their hand. It says, who wants to change? And everybody puts their hands down. Like, the need for reform and the need for all of that is, you know, everybody desires it, it's palpable. But going through that process, everybody knows, you know, adversity is not easy. Like, changing is not easy. The discomfort and disruption. I think this country's going through something quite unique. Like with, the debate is, the sunlight that's being shown on like the media and Congress, is it revealing what's always been there, right? The whole thing about the veneer of oh, you know, because people think of like Walter Cronkite.
But I think that's why people don't they don't want to take that stance, or they'll still listen to the news. And, I think it's because they're scared the fact that you've been being lied to this whole time. Walter Cronkite was also part of the system. Like,
So that's the thing.
and I think that it's been going on for a long time. That's why you have all these conspiracy theories of like back then, which no one could prove, or but now we're starting to see like those conspiracy theories are probably true, right?
I refuse to believe that Walter Cronkite was a part of this system.
I think anybody that's part of the media is part of the system.
Well, yeah, because you just think about it. Like back in the day when they say, "Oh, news was great," it was like 4 stations. Like imagine the power they had.
Yeah.
Like if it was ABC, CBS, and a couple others, and it was just them, and like you would turn on the news,
And the people that listen didn't have the ability to fact check or like get a different opinion, because you're being fed through the TV, and you're like, oh, okay, that's it. That's what I'm thinking,
And so the difficulty now, right, where we're in this period of flux, and it's like information's coming at us 18 ways from 18 different mediums. How do you decide what's true and what isn't? That's the difficulty, right? I tend to think when people say, oh my gosh, it's crazy, and how do we know the truth and all that stuff? I'm like, well, I think that eventually you start to sift through and then find honorable, reasonable, verifiable people. The mainstream media can't stand Joe Rogan, right? They can't stand that a dude that does a 3-hour podcast, that hosted Fear Factor and is a UFC commentator, has more views than all of them combined and just signed a $200 million extension of his original $300 million Spotify contract. Like, they're like, it blows their mind. They hate it because in that sense, they've lost their power, their gatekeeping power. And there's a free form sense to that. In 3 hours, people's eyeballs are where the money goes now.
Well, you can flesh something out in 3 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, Joe Rogan, I think, is awesome. Good for him.
Well, what people don't realize about him too is that he has everybody on, and that's strange to a medium like CNN or NBC. Where like, yeah, he'll have a freaking psycho person on, but the thing is like, oh my God, you're platforming someone that like the audience can see they're there for 3 hours. Like they get to judge for themselves.
Well, that's what they don't understand is you can't bullshit your way through 3 hours. So like even the guests he has on, they might just BS for 3 hours of whatever their stance is, but that gives the listener, you have 3 hours to sit there and listen to this person, and your bullshit meter can go off and they'll be like, dude, this guy, and Rogan's very good at, he's like he doesn't have a side. He's just like, I'm having you on, let's talk.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good way for the listeners to actually critically think and be like, you know what? I either agree with this person or I don't agree with this person. Instead of being force-fed a 5-minute clip or 3-minute clip of, what, like when we went on Fox, it's the same thing. It's like you have 2 minutes to spout off whatever you need to spout off, but also the hard part of that is not only do you have 2 minutes to spout off what you spout off, but you also have to fight against what they're trying to push, like their narrative, and they're trying to drive the questions to get what they want. So it doesn't really matter what you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. People don't like when there was a 3-4 month period where Andrew and I were on the news every other day, every 3 days in some form or fashion. Like I got to a point where I started to do the like objective analysis. I'd call a producer and be like, well, how long is they call it a hit? Like how long is your hit? 5 minutes, 4 minutes? I'm like, all right. And I would start to mathematically dissect it. All right, well that's typically a 20-second, 30-second introduction. They turn the question over to me, how long do I typically get? Oh, I get 30 seconds. Well, what can I say in 30 seconds? And then they respond. And I would have it rehearsed because I was like, it's better to do that. But it was such a stupid, like, I was sitting there being like, all right, well, in my 3 30-second responses, how can I encapsulate the case, where we're at, why this is important, why people should care? And it really is silly. Now, and then they're like, all right, cool. Now with our advertisers, and you'd go off to a farmer commercial and then you'd come back. And we had to do it because that was just, it was what we had to do. But it is, to me, like the funny thing of being on literally every single news station. Andrew and I were on Fox, ABC, CNN, CBS, MSNBC. Dude, we were on every mainstream, every non-mainstream. Like I was on ridiculous podcasts I never heard of. Like the motorcycle one was always
That one's great.
That was like always the chuckle. Well, like even I knew.
Can I back you up before you
Yeah.
go into there? When you got the news that Eddie had been arrested and all that, what was that like from your perspective?
It was awful. I mean, I have a very like vivid, clear memory of it. Like Andrew gave me a call, and at first, I mean, I think all of us were like this. Like our first 2-3 weeks was, this is going to get resolved. Like this is a big mistake. Like Andrea called, she's like, hey, and like you could already tell Andrea. This is why I love Andrea. She had already like exerted all the emotion. Like she had already dealt with you.
Yeah.
She had already. So
She was kids.
Yeah, and so she was calling me, and she was calling my parents, and it was like she had already spent all that stuff. She had zero time to be like listen. Because I went at first. You had the what? You know, like wait a minute, and you asked all the questions, and then I was like, all right, well, what are we doing? And she's like, Sean, and so the first analysis was just like, all right, he was in the break, and you had, I think initially, you had like, oh, next week you're going to have some hearing.
The kangaroo court hearing. Yeah.
And so we all had the false hope that, all right, well, this is just a big mistake. He's going to go before, and they're going to let him out, and then we're going to be able to resolve this. And the hard part was, I think, that first month or two, where I think all of us individually had a click, and I had a click where I was just like, all right, the normal processes at B are not on, they're not on our side. There's no normal, like, they have gone balls to the wall. Like, Ed's now persona non grata. Like, that's it. They went after it, and they made a decision. There's no, oh, if you just hear me out, if I just give you more data, if I just let you hear him story, this will all be fixed. They were like, fuck him. He's gone.
I mean, they told, to give you like my command, my dad went to go visit, both my parents went to go visit my command, like the first month I was locked, just to like, why is this happening? And the only thing they told, like literally verbatim, was like, if you knew what we knew about your son, you'd want him locked up for life. But they wouldn't, like, that's all we're telling you.
Yeah.
And it was complete BS. But so, yeah, like to Sean's point, there was no logical, like, decision making. It's like, nope, you are done. You are a target, and we are going to do everything we can to bury you.
Yeah. And that took me, again, I have like a good faith presumption. Like, if I only talked to the right person, if I only got to bend somebody's ear. Like, because I can remember, like, his initial legal team, which was awful, but we were all like, do we blow this up? Do we keep it under wraps? And the first decision was, no, let's keep it under wraps. Let's not go public. Let's try and work behind the scenes. I met with the Senate Armed Services Committee. I met with the House Armed Services Committee. I was calling people I knew that used to work at the DOD, and I was like, all right, he's in the break. Like, who's in charge? Like, how do I talk to that person? What do we do? And I was just trying to organizationally figure out the best way to just communicate what I thought was a reasonable message. And we also had the presumption of NSW is going to help you out. Like, that's a tight-knit community. They're going to come to his aid. And I think that was your come to Jesus moment, too, where Andrea was like, hey, you got to let go. Like, you got to let go of that institution.
Yeah. I've talked about that before.
And that was a big thing for, I mean, even my dad, my dad was as Army gets. Like, 22 years in the service, West Point grad, super faith in the system. His whole thing the whole time was like, this is a big mistake. We've got, as soon as they're going to fix it. And then the hard conversations was, hey, not only are they not going to fix it, but we're going to have to fight them. Like, this is a full out us versus them. And then when you realize, like, when that posture came, it was like, all right, like, fuck around and find out. Like, here we go. Like, off to the races. And at that point, I was just like, no door unturned. Like, I'll talk to anybody. And that was Andrew and I's mentality. We were just like, I mean, I had the best ace in the hole possible, where I would talk to all these people, and I was just like, I figured out the right path, who to talk to, how to do it. Not necessarily, there was no, like, plan A, you got to do this, but I would talk to everybody, and I was like, all right, if you don't want to talk to me, talk to Andrea. Like, you're going to hear from her. And like,
how gangsters?
Dude, it was the best. It was the best. It was the same thing with our original legal team, which was awful. I was like, if you're not giving us the answers you want, like, good luck, buddy. Like, I'm the nice guy. Like, just wait. And like, Andrew would be like, all right. I'd be like,
she was called the nuclear option.
Yeah. And that was the thing. Like, it was it's like, you can't, people saw what she was doing, but like Andrew and I would talk every day, multiple times a day. Like, you cannot fathom the work that she did, the heart that she put into it, the skills that she has. Like, all the adjectives fall short of what she did and how she did it and the poise that she had, taking care of the family and visiting him, and like just the cool, calm, and collected, just killer that she was on that beat. Like, I've never seen someone hone to a task and just nail it like she did. And it was the best partner ever. Like, we were every day we're like, what are we doing? And like, we would just, okay, I'm doing this, you're doing that, here we go. And then it was just a momentum game at that point. You know, you just built up enough. And yeah, eventually we got to a point where the strategy was like, the more we shine light on it, like the more we talk about him, and then the more we just are like, well, this is how he's being treated, and this is what they're saying. Like, nobody in their right mind is going to be like, this is normal, this is okay in this country. And also, I just got incensed because, and this is a question I was going to ask you, like, I don't think that this country, talk about the bifurcation of, you know, we have 1% that serves in the military, and like 1% of that 1% goes to combat. And like, no one knows what you do. Like, no one knows what the day in and day out of that is. And I think that Ed's trial, part of it that I tried to, because I always tried to understand where they're coming from. That was my whole thing, because it was just good tactics. Like, what are they going to say? How are they feeling about it? What's their perspective? And the whole thing is everyone was just straight up uncomfortable. Like, they didn't want to face the truth about what the SEALs do. Like, I always laugh because I had this very funny memory of Ed and Beto and other people visiting me in DC one time, and we were all drinking and hanging out. And the hilarity is that like people to this day still don't get it. Like, the old school commercials of like Navy SEALs popping out of the water. You know, there's that one at night, you guys pop out of the water and it's like footprints on the sand.
Yeah.
And then the water washes over the
So
sand
far
prints.
from the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, they're all laughing. He's like, realistically, it's someone pops up and they're like, oh, I lost a fin.
Yeah.
Fuck. You know, and they're like,
Trying to drag their rucksack through the
they're
surf.
Like, and it's not quiet. But my whole premise about that, when I would talk to reporters or when I would talk to people, I'm like, what do you think they're going to do? Like, the commercial is cool. You see them pop out of the water. Like, what do you think their objective is? They're going to kill people. Like, that's what they do. Like, this whole thing, like, people have this like very kid-glovey, bubbly thing. Like, oh, Special Forces, SEALs, this is awesome. I'm like, what's the job of a warrior? Like, they are uncomfortable with the end result. And like, I get it. Like, that's why not a lot of people do it. You don't have to do it. Like, people are willing to do it. But in my sense, that I started to understand that Ed's trial was almost like a come to Jesus, like this reconciliation with, all right, 20 years at war. This is what war is really like. And because that's what I see now. I see the same conversation happening with, there's a bunch of other shit and politics in it, but like Israel, Gaza, then Ukraine, Russia. Like, a lot of it's on social media now, way more than it was GWAT. And I think that people are like, this is what happens. Like, there's no nice way of doing this.
No.
There's no knocking on the door and being like, sir, please, would you not come across our border and kill 2,000 of our people? Like, in order to stop that, it's violence. And violence is never clean. And I think that when people saw the picture, when people saw what was going on, I'm like, what do you think they're doing? And that's when I realized that they didn't want to hear that answer. Like, when you send a SEAL platoon over to Mosul and they're watching ISIS mow down people, like, you can talk about, but I started to get incensed because my anger built with, I was like, you fucking sent him over there. This is his mission. Like, your country did it. The people you elected, if you want to be angry at them. Like, they vote on it. Like, I was there. Like, they vote to reauthorize, they vote to send. That's the culpability. Don't get mad at the guy who's given the mission and goes over and does it. That's where I got, like, because my whole thing was just like the same question or same response over and over again. You can probably see I'm getting pissed about it, but like, my whole thing was just like, you have no fucking clue what they do. Like, you have no idea. And good, you don't need to, but don't question. Like, don't judge. And I was like, strap on a gun, go join them if you want to do it. Then you can offer an opinion. Direct your fire at the people who green light it, because Ed doesn't go anywhere this country doesn't send him. Those guys don't do a job that hasn't been approved and authorized and all of that stuff. And it was all of this.
It's the same guys that green lighted it that are trying to come against him and go.
Oh, that was the other point of like, fury for me, because it was like the same people that were involved in that process. Because the whole thing, I mean, like every politician that got up there and was like, oh, this is shameful. And I'm like, didn't you vote to authorize this? This is on your hands, buddy. Like, you're the one who clicks yes. You know, you put your card in the slot in the House of Representatives, you authorized it, you gave stump speeches about how important this was, and now you're second guessing. And like, that's where I was just like, all right, this is like, fuck you guys. Like, we're just gonna light you up, because in my mind, that was the depth of just cynicism and hypocrisy and all of those things. Because there was a culmination of all of these people were just waxing poetic and singing moral platitudes, all the while having been involved in the process the whole time. And the best people that I met were the ones that had been over there. Like, dude, the number of calls too, like Eddie's trial was weird because Andrew and I's phone, numbers got out to the community, and we would just get I would get phone calls from Vietnam vets. And like, they would just talk to me for like an hour. Like, and they're like, you have no idea what I was asked to do. They have no idea, what our job was. And he's like, they're second guessing. And they would just, and I realized that part of my job was just like for people to vent at. And I was like, dude, that's why we're working, like, join, like, donate, do whatever you can, like, talk to other people. And they're like, all right. But they needed like an ear to bend about, and that was the weird thing. I just felt like your case it became so much bigger than just the individual.
Oh, if that's the way we looked at it. I mean, and that Apple documentary, The Line, which I think is great. But that is like a perfect title, because my case drew a line in the sand, and in our community, just in the military in general. And it was, the way we looked at it is like, if we don't fight this to the very end and then they win and they find me guilty, it sets a precedence for everybody else that's been fighting in the GWAT. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the way I looked at it. I was like, I am a symbol for all the other guys that have been fighting the past 20 years. I didn't do anything different that I've been doing since the beginning since the invasion. Yeah. And so it's like, if they find me guilty for this, they're gonna find everybody guilty. I mean, it's happening in Australia. It's happening over in Britain with the SAS dudes. They're coming after all of them still for the past 20 years of war. So I think our victory, I mean, it was the prime example. Like, because we won, they dropped like 3 or 4 other cases against SEALs, because they're like, and we're not going to win these because we just crushed them in court, which was awesome. But that was the purpose of it. I mean, yeah, it was obvious to free me and to get me back to the family, but it was also like, if we don't fight this, other people are going to be screwed.
Do you remember when so all of us were in deliberations? We had this like room in the upper courthouse. So there's the courthouse at the bottom, and it was up. And I remember it was mom and dad, and we were all in the room, like all lawyers, whole team was in the room, and our lawyer was going to go over his like opening statement. And they're like, hey, do you have any input? And I was like, yeah. And then I was like, oh, we got to go before that. You guys really did the last minute planning. But I remember being like, in your opening statement, can you say that? Can you look at the Marines on the panel and be like, this involves you? Like, this is an aspersion on everybody. And they're like, I can't say that. And I was like, why can't you say that? They're like, oh, it has to be germane to the case. And then I remember being like, well, make it about as much as you can. Make it about, because everybody knew that your case was not just about you. I think at that point, it was a wider net. But that was my main thing. I was just like, dude, you can't, like, try to as much as you can in the words you say and how you articulate it, impress upon the jury panel that. And I think that by the end they knew. They were like, oh, all right.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Let me ask this perspective from you. Do you think how much did Trump tweeting about it just completely help it and elevate his case?
Well, so yeah, the biggest I was going to ask Eddie to talk about it. The biggest misconception is that Trump pardoned Eddie, and I always say that that.
There's articles that are even, that's the title of the article.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so false.
And to be quite frank, like, Andrew and I and Eddie had conversations about, we had such little faith in the process, and this is where Ed's character shines through, and I would say that this is one of the ballsiest things he's ever done. Like, we had a conversation about, should we let because the conversation, there was never an outreach from the administration like, do you guys want a pardon? It was always like us being like, well, what's going to happen? Like people often feel like we had some direct line of communication and that we were like talking to the right people. We would see a tweet and be like, oh shit.
Yeah.
Like we would be like, whoa, what does this mean? Like we were on the receiving end just like the public. The tweet obviously to let him out was just instrumental because Eddie got to actually sit with it. Like people have no idea how bullshit him being in the brig was. The level of like shadiness of them not letting you see your lawyers, not letting them go on medical visits. Like the number of times I was calling NSW and be like, you guys aren't sending your van over because they were supposed to pick him up and let him go to a doctor's visit and they wouldn't. And like they didn't know what they were doing. It was a mixture of like just malfeasance and incompetence. So like Eddie getting out and being able to sit in a room like this and be like, hey, I reviewed all the evidence, let's prepare, was just night and day. Like, and it took you guys like 2 to 3 weeks. That's all, like 2 to 3 weeks of prep to sit, and everybody got in a war room, and yeah, and it was finally like he was able to fight on a semi-level playing field. And this is the other thing that I think that I really get pissed at is that people think that, they look back at the trial and they're like, oh, Sean and Andrea were on the news and like they were able to manipulate the public. Like this is the bad faith. Look at it. Like you guys had all this stuff and the government was hamstrung. And I'm like, you have no idea. They set the rules of the battle space. Like what?
Well, that's the most pathetic argument that I've heard them like. Oh, it was unfair that your brother and your wife were on, and I heard like it was the Secretary of the Navy who got relieved, but he was like, oh, they played the fox fiddle and we couldn't do anything. And here's the thing, man. I'm like, that just shows how weak our Navy leadership is. They will play the victim role no matter what, and it's like, dude, you had the upper hand the whole time. You locked me away. Yeah. With no charges, no bail, to where and you did everything in your power to make sure that I could not defend myself properly. You corrupted the media. You put out fake narratives. I mean, I don't know if there was anything else they could have done besides like, and they tried to get me to flip out. They had people come fuck with me in the prison. They had guards stripping me naked. They had like doing all sorts of things to me to get me to whatever, snap. And we won. And at the end of the day, they can still sit there and play the victim role, which that's a epidemic in our society. It's an epidemic in our military leadership. We have the worst military leadership this country has ever seen right now. Right now, our military is just as corrupt as the politicians. I mean, the government. It's bad. And that everything that's fed down to the guys, men and women that serve this military is all from the leaders. It's an agenda to get promoted. So that's why you see all this woke BS and all this crap. But yeah, it just showed, it made me smile, dude, when they had that response. Like, oh, we're the victims. Yeah. The Gallaghers, there's nothing we could do. Like, but I do love it because I'm like, yeah. You guys are weak.
There's like part of me that's like, I wish there was a camera on us the whole time. I wish people could see the hill that we had to climb. Like originally from them being like, can't talk to him, you can't do it. Like the deck was so stacked, they controlled the rules of evidence, what you could and couldn't submit. They were like, he can't speak, the lawyers can't, they could put a gag order on it. The witnesses that we were allowed to call, they controlled that. They're like, you can call this guy, but you can't call this guy. They were dishing out immunity deals. They controlled the whole thing.
And they still lost.
Like, that's the thing is like, and then when
it's pathetic.
The Secretary of Navy is like, he's carrying his briefcase on the way out after he's fired, which is still wild, by the way. There's still part of me that looks back and I'm like, this is nuts. Like when he was out, we're like, oh man. And he comes out and he's like, oh, they were on the news and all this stuff. And I'm like, are you... Like me getting on Fox and Friends in the morning to literally plead, just look at the case. We weren't saying anything outlandish. We were just like, would you look at it? Yeah. And then you will see. They're like, oh, that was unfair. And I'm like, bro.
About as unfair as the Secretary of Navy sending out emails to organizations that were supporting us, telling those organizations not to support me and that I was guilty. Secretary of the Navy was doing this while I was locked up. Yeah. So for him, and that's what I mean. It's all just BS, dude. Like him coming out being like, it was unfair and we have ethics and morality and this. It's like, dude, those are just words. Those are just words, and you don't believe in them
well,
one
this
bit.
is the thing that I don't think that most people understand too, is that they put a gag order, so they controlled the evidence and they put a gag order on Ed and the lawyers all the while. People don't know that you won a lawsuit. That's another thing that Eddie.
Against the
yeah. So like
corrupt lawyers.
This is the thing people usually, because there's also this thing of like, oh, yeah, Eddie was found innocent or he was acquitted, but there's still some sneaky, and I'm always like, you have no. Eddie sued the Navy after, like, you're probably one of the only people in history that sued the military because what they were doing is they were leaking information. So they said, we control the evidence, we control what you see and what we have. They had everything, by the way. We control what you can say. You can't say anything, but we can leak. And so they were leaking to the press, and people just don't know that after the fact, we got them because they leaked Ed's documents to the press. And so the New York Times published Ed's social security number in one of those. Yeah. So they had a tranche of documents.
Yeah.
So this is usually like a post-mortem, like after the fact. If people are ever doubtful, I'm like, well, let me tell you the story. That Ed sued the Navy because they leaked his documents. We proved that they illegally leaked them to the press to smear him in lieu of trial, like before he went to court. To talk about tainting a jury pool and tainting the media and all that stuff. They leaked it, and they made a mistake in that they just sent them everything, or the New York Times made a mistake in that they published too much, because there was documents in there that you guys were able to prove that only we had, that like only the Navy had, meaning that the stuff that was published had personally identifiable information of him, and they were like, well, we don't have those documents, only you have them. So the court was like, oh, well, here you go, like the Navy's guilty, and they had to pay Ed and Andrea like a small nominal. I wish they had to pay you guys like a gajillion, but it was more of a moral victory than anything else.
And here's the thing, like even when we did the online court hearing thing for, when we were suing the Navy, dude, this is how arrogant and elitist they are, is they sat there and they're like, what really did we do to you? Like they said that on, and they're like, you seem to be doing fine. And so, and then the judge asked me, she's like, what do you want out of this? And of course, I was not prepared to answer that question. Like, pretty much like, how much money are you looking for? Mm-hmm. And I said, and I'm like looking at Tim, who's on the other, I'm like, what am I supposed to say? Which was Tim was my lawyer. And all I told her, I was like, I don't even want money. I just want them to admit that they fucked up, that they made a mistake, and I want them to acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. And the Navy's like, nope.
Yeah.
Like straight up, like no. And then, so they ended up coming back with a settlement. Like, hey, we'll pay you this, and it wasn't that much. But and
it wasn't anything at all.
No. And at the end of the day, we made a decision. Like, but here's
wait, no,
that's what you think.
I don't want listeners to think that Eddie. No, they gave nothing.
Yeah.
And
but here, let me just explain something real quick. We could have like made a decision like, nope, we don't want the settlement. We're taking you to court. We would have spent more money. Yeah. Because you're taking the United States government to court. Dude, they have every resource at their disposal. We just went through 2 years of that. So I think Andrew and I were like, you know what? Like we're done.
Yeah,
like,
this is also 2 years after the fact. Yeah, like, you guys are moving on.
Take this and get out of here.
Yeah, this is.
I wish I was on that call, Eddie. I've been like, I'll take that question. He'll take $3.7 billion.
Yeah.
He'll take your entire cash of Bitcoin.
But it goes to, I will say this, like, it goes to the importance, and I'm just gonna, tie a ribbon on it. Like, that's why elections are important, and that's why accountability is important. Like one of the only mechanisms. So, what Eddie just said is picture perfect about the way the government works. They were wrong. We had them dead to rights. We had the evidence, and they knew eventually they were going to have to be like, all right, yeah, we screwed up. You have the documents. You caught us. We leaked them to the New York Times. We weren't supposed to do that. But what they could have done is been like, great, we're going to make this a 3-year-long process. You're going to have to pay your lawyer. We're just going to move court dates. Oh, we're supposed to be in July. Well, now it's going to be in January. And they can just do this. There's no accountability. The only accountability that's there is finally if you get someone underneath them that then can be like, all right, we're changing everything. Like, you're out, new person's in. It has to be culture. And that culture comes from elections. And like, I can't stress that enough, is that I know that there's a disassociation between what people feel like they can have an impact on and what you see. It takes a long time. but I still have faith in it. Like, I still think that, one, it's worthy and necessary, but it can be done. Because the moment you think that it can't, like, none of us ever gave up, right? Like, Ed wouldn't be here if we did. I still think, I mean, it's awful what we needed to go through and all of that stuff. But, yeah,
Hey, what was it like when you were in the courtroom and they gave the verdict? And describe that.
I don't know your perspective. I remember, like, there was a couple times, like, I remember that initial phone call with Andrea pacing around my basement. They're like, Ed's locked up. And I'm like, and I remember being in the courtroom. Like, I remember that whole thing. Because we were at, like, a PX. We didn't know when the verdict was going to be read. The jury was deliberating, and, like, it could have been a day, it could have been 3 weeks. We were just like, all right, so we're just waiting around. And the hilarious thing, too, is that Ed's in his dress whites. Like, Ed's entire military career, I'd only ever seen him in uniform in a photo. Like, I had never seen him in person. So, like, 2 weeks, he's, like, sharp. He's, like, changing his belt out, like, so that his fingerprints aren't on it. And I'm like, oh. But, yeah, no, when the verdict was read, like, that was time slowed down, heart beating. And I always think about, I only saw Eddie get mad. Like, again, I started with, like, Ed is as transparent as you get. Like, if he's pissed, you know he's pissed. When the dudes that testified on the trial about the raid, like, you could just see, I was sitting directly behind Ed. Ed just, like, bowed up. And you could just see redness. Like, if there was nobody in the room, those dudes are dead. Like, I knew it. There's a couple other times I saw you move. Ed was stoic the whole time. During the verdict, he was a little riled beforehand because this is how arrogant the Navy was. They sent 2 military police officers from the jail, from the brig. They were like, oh, we're going to get him. Those 2 guys were there to escort Ed as soon as the guilty verdict was read back to brig.
Well, to Leavenworth.
Yeah, to Leavenworth, yeah. Essentially, you would have been...
That's what they told me. They're like, because I knew them both. And I was like, hey, what's up, guys? Like, you know, I'm like, what are you guys doing? They're like, we're here to take you to Leavenworth today. Yeah. And I'm like, like, they were that, like, the command was that confident.
Yeah, they were that brazen.
Even though the command never showed up to my trial.
But when Ed saw them and he realized what was going on, I remember you just being like, what the fuck? And then you were just looking at him, and that kind of set the tone for me, because that was when the verdict was about to be read. Like, the Navy still thinks that this isn't the bad. And look, I think, honestly, it was kind of, you'd have to, like, be inside my head at that moment. I always say, I wish the world saw, I wish, like, you could just video stream, like, read Ed's book, the audio's in there. I wish you could video stream the trial. We have nothing to hide. Like, I wish everybody got to see it, because then you'd be like, oh, there's no question. Like, we weren't embellishing anything. Like, this was all, like, plain as day. But, and again, this goes back to the pardon question, like, I had no faith in the institution at that point. There was part of me that was like, even though we made this case, even though it's night and day, even though, like, any commonsensical person would look at it, I was like, there's still a huge chance they read guilty, and then here we go. Like, it's just off to the next step. Ed's in Leavenworth, and now we're fighting for appeal. Like, that was very, very real. And there was also a period of, they read all the not guilties, and they read 1 guilty, and there was, like, this, like, what does that mean? Like, they were like, not guilty, not guilty, guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And all of us were like, and then I think we had to at that, I remember Tim looking, and he was like, oh, it's fine. And then we're like, yeah, then
yeah, it was conduct unbecoming.
Yeah.
Was the guilty thing for taking a picture. Right? Yeah, I had served well, they threw the book at me, but I had served double of what the punishment was already.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but that moment was, I mean, it was great afterwards, but I think it was pretty awful. Because, again, this is where Ed's, brass balls came into play. I wasn't there with you on the conversation with that, but I had the conversations with Tim, and I had the conversations with Andrea about pardons, because it was all about, like, do we ask for one now?
Well, no, the word was, so there was that Green Beret,
yeah,
and Clint Lawrence, the Army guy,
yeah,
and they were getting pardoned, and Trump was like, I think the word we got was like, he was going to pardon me before the trial, because he saw what a sham it was, and Andrew and I talked to Tim, and I was like, we both were like, we don't want it.
Yeah.
Like, can we, if he tries to pardon me, can we refuse it?
Yeah.
Because
we
have, like, in my mind, I was like, we have fought collectively, everybody, tooth and nail to get to this point. like to just throw in the towel and be like, okay, we'll take the pardon. And a pardon means you're guilty, by the way. Like
But people don't realize how like amazing of a decision that was by you, because I had moments.
by us.
I had moments when I was talking to Tim. I was like, look, this is a pretty awesome case. Like I can't, because this was kind of before trial and all that stuff. I was like, you guys seem to be pretty confident. Nothing has been fair at this point. They haven't abided by, like, why do I have any faith that we're actually, like, Eddie's actually allowed, that Tim's actually allowed to present? So the decision was, do you take the risk? Do you say no, take the risk, and then does the president or whoever's powers that be change their mind after a guilty verdict is read wrongly? And then you say, well, we wanted to, take a look at the transcript, ask somebody post-mortem to do it. I mean, that was the decision. It was like a life-death decision. Was, okay, and a part of me was just like, I have pride. I want the innocent, like I want the whole thing, but I also want Ed to live the rest of his life. And like, I'm willing to, I was like, I'll be honest, I was like, I'm willing to be okay with that decision. Because in my mind, I was like, I can live with the fact that I know the truth and everything, like, it doesn't change me. But Ed's out, and like, we're free of it. And like, a pardon is straight, they can't go after him again. But
Again, though, like we talked about what my trial was about in the first place. If we would have taken a pardon, that means every other dude that served in the GWAT is guilty.
Yeah.
So it was bigger than us.
But that's why I think.
Yeah.
Again, I wasn't part of that conversation with you because you were in different rooms and talking. And obviously, at that point, this was also the awesome thing is that like Andrew and I had to make all these decisions while Ed was in the brig, and then it was like always communicating to Ed. Hey, we had this conversation. This was going because you were like, "What the fuck is going on?"
Yeah, it was a mess.
It was a mess. It was this game of telephone, and it was always trying to coordinate. Right, communication was the backlog about like what actually is happening. But Ed was out at this point, and it was a great thing for me because I no longer felt, because I always felt, because you're kind of acting on your behalf, and like to this day, try and make a decision on Eddie's behalf, see how he feels. Like, it's not easy. And this was all like life and death. And so like having the burden of that lifted. And I was like, well, this is, clearly this is Eddie's decision to make. I will give you my input. Yeah, and everything at that point was, this system is designed. They have built it up. They have manifested it. All the whole thing I said about Eddie the whole time, I was like, past actions dictate future behavior. None of this makes sense for Eddie. None of it does. Like, look at his past action. Does this make sense? But then judging the Navy, I was like, look at everything they've done. Do you think that we get a fair, like Tim one time took me aside and gave me a little talking to, like we did a press conference on the Hill after the video was shown. And I just started lambasting everybody. I was like, fuck these people. I'm like, da, da, da. He's like, you can't, disperse the judge. And I was like, at what point, like, do you think that I still think they're acting in good faith? I was like, I don't think that anybody has any severance of objectivity or neutrality. I was like, they're out to get him. We know that. And he was like, well, you still have to, he's trying to do things like, don't burn a bridge before, we cross over it. And I was just like, dude, at this point, everything they've done.
Yeah. And I think, but that was the beauty of it too with you and Andrea, because the lawyers will always like play the safe side. They're like, don't say this, even though it's the truth, because this could hurt us. And I think the majority of the time, Andrea and Sean both were like, fuck that. Like, I'm going to say what I want. And I think that was the right decision. It was like, we're so far past like being scared of the repercussions. It was like, there is no other repercussion.
Yeah, that was it.
Like, unless you're going to give me an electric chair tomorrow. Like, other than that, like I'm facing life without parole, and I don't care what I say about you now, or what you guys said. It was like, it's the truth. And I think the Navy and even our lawyers at times were like, they couldn't handle it. They were like, I mean, I don't know how many times Andrea was told, well, this was by my first set of lawyers, to stop posting stuff, stop using social media. It's not good. You're making the military mad. It's like, good.
Yeah.
Fuck them.
Yeah.
Like what do we have to lose at this point? But that's also part of the system there too. Like the lawyers and everybody, if they're all in cahoots, not the legal team that we went to court with. Oh, they definitely were spot on, awesome. But the ones you had before, everybody is working for everybody. So
Yeah.
it's nobody wants you to upset the balance or like the system. And I think that is also why our case was so big, because we went right up against it and we were like, nope, we're not taking this.
Well, I also say, like, one of the huge lessons learned, right, was, Andrew and I and you made that decision early on, where there was none of this, like, veneer of propriety, like some facade of, like, oh, we're going to let them do this and then we're going to respond in kind. It was just like, go, like balls to the wall, go. And I think the lesson learned, like, and this is what we talk to other people about in their defense, when we're in their own legal cases, I'm like, don't buy into the trust the process thing. Like, it's stacked against you. Like, fight as if your life is on the line, because it is. And you have to adopt that mentality and that tactic every day. And don't let them, just wait till the next hearing. Oh, don't say this. Like, there are sometimes probably some caveats about, like, you can probably do some damage to yourself beforehand, but on cases like ours, like, dude, once they issue the charges, and even before that, they've made their decision. That's it. Like, there was no, we're going to wait to hear the other side, which is, it was weird, man. Like, looking back on it, like, it's wild. Like, people don't understand, too. Like, Ed and I, it's weird that you're, like, no. Like, the irony, and we were talking about this yesterday.
Anyone should have been known it was going to be you.
Or Andrea, or, like, somebody, like, Eddie is the last person in our family, like, the very last person that anyone, like, the fact that he's public and people know who, like, the oddity, and most people, like, I have to say, this is also what we talked about last night, like, the trial ended 5 years ago next month, which is wild, right? Like, I had my second kid in the midst of everything. Now I have a third. My second kid is now 5. Like, it's wild how much time has passed and all of that stuff. It is still, like, this is when you realize, too, like, just the distance between what you see and what reality is in the country. Like, I've been with Ed in a liquor store and someone recognizes him and buys him a bottle of whiskey. And, like, it is very comforting to me to know that there's like good-natured, good-hearted, and like we were talking about the media before, like, I would get calls all the time that as soon as Eddie was vilified in the New York Times, we got more support. Like, people were like, as soon as I saw that, I knew he was innocent. And I was like, what? I thought it would be the opposite. Like, people are good. And we were talking about this last night, like, the longer now away from the trial, like, I'm getting worked up about it because I'm talking about all the assholes that were involved in it and how much I hate them and how much I think that they're destroying the country and all that stuff. But I tend to think now retrospectively, and again, this is me being an optimist, like, there were so many kind and good-natured people.
Oh, for sure.
That helped us along the way. Like, and I was mentioning too last night, like, there's this family called the Yaconiacs that he was a team guy.
Rob and Shar,
and
they
like,
showed up every weekend and visited me.
Like, Rob did not know Eddie. Didn't know him. And because Ed was a SEAL, because it was just in the news, Rob was like, I'm going to visit him with Shar. They would visit him, and I'm not joking, every weekend on public visiting hours. So every weekend, Eddie had just one opportunity during the weekend for someone to come in and say, hey, like, to break from all of the shit they're putting him through. These people did not know us.
No,
and, like,
same with Ed Heiner.
Yeah.
These were team guys that I never worked with, that did not know, but Aaron Kahn, who was my buddy that I worked out with at the MMA gym all the time. We had, a relationship, just like, hey, we went and worked out at the same time. He came and visited me every weekend. I mean, that is like, and I talk about it all the time. It's that whole thing, as traumatic as it was the biggest blessing ever. I'm like, in the long run, it was a lesson in a lesson in so many things. But it just showed me that there are good people in this world, people that care, and it also forces you to care. Like, because when I was in, I was just like, nope, I'm doing the job of a SEAL, and that's it. I have no other outside.
People don't realize how apolitical you were.
Yeah, I wasn't political at all. I'm like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, no matter who's president.
I had conversations with him because I was in Congress. Like, I would send him stuff like, hey, we're doing this. And you're like, dude, I don't care. You're like, I don't care. I don't even think about it. You're like, but I'm getting deployed next month. I don't give a shit. And I was like, but you should care. You're like, dude, I don't. And it was really funny.
But
'cause I
that's
was
how
like,
most people are in the community.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
it was full of integrity because you were just like, I have a job. None of that matters to me. Like I have a job to do. And I was like, but no, you don't realize like you're on the downstream effect of these decisions that goes on. And then it's funny that you became a centerpiece of why it matters to do, you know, the policy and the politics, why culture goes down. But yeah, you being the irony, there's a sweet irony to Ed being the face of, you know, it being public. What do you think, in retrospect, like outside the pardon thing, what do you think the biggest misconception or misperception is of the trial, like when public talk about it? Because I have an answer.
I mean, we already covered like the pardon thing. That's still out there. Like people stay out, you know, that I was pardoned, and I'm tired of even responding to it. It's like I wasn't. But I think the biggest, still to this day, like Corey Scott, you know, when he came in there and it was like the big bombshell, people, I think, they think I knew that was going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, no, I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had an inkling like something was going to happen, but not that. You know what I mean? So I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions. But I don't know. What do you think?
That it was inevitable,
What?
that you'd be innocent, that be found innocent. My whole thing is people look at the trial and I think that they get this sense of, oh, it was going to work out. So like when I talk to people, I think the perception is, oh, it would have worked out in the end anyway.
What does that mean?
They think that, like, and it's not explicitly said, but it's like, oh, given everything that happened in the trial, given all of this stuff, the truth would have sussed to the surface regardless. Like, it's almost like a naive retrospective, right? Like, to me, the misperception that people think is like, oh, your brother's innocent. It would have come out anyways. Like, this result was inevitable in some sense. Like, the truth shall set you free, right? And that's from, like, I look them close and I'm like, you have no idea. I'm like, they don't care about that. That's what's awful, is that they knew he was innocent and they were willing to lock him away anyways.
Yeah,
As a matter of fact,
but that's just like telling people that the media is lying to them, right? There's certain people that refuse to believe, and they can't fathom that the system would do that to somebody. And I honestly, I don't blame them.
Yeah,
like, because you really don't know until it happens to you. I would have been like that too. Like, no, like, why would they do this to somebody until it happened to me? And then I'm like, holy shit. Like the veil's lifted, you see behind the curtain. But even to this day, you know, I don't blame people for having those misconceptions, or still like, oh, I don't know, there's something shady, you know, because the government just wouldn't do that. It's like, okay, well, you know, they will. But I mean, look what they just did to our former president. Like, that right there shows you everything. It's like, if they want to target you, they will make up some BS to target you, and they will spend every waking moment trying to condemn you.
yeah, I just think in the acceptance of that, I think people really struggle, because in accepting that premise, so much of the veneer, so much of the facade, so much of your good feeling nature about how the system works crumbles. And if that crumbles, then you open yourself up to the reality that is super uncomfortable. And in that discomfort, you have to sit and be like, oh man, bad actors are out there. Like, everybody isn't, and all that stuff. But again, to me, I just think that sometimes I run into that. People are like, oh no, your brother would have been fine. Like, they don't say that, but I think it's the sense of, yeah, there were some bad actors there and blah, 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 but it all would have worked out in the end. And I'm just like, no. That actually, if it wasn't for Ed and the family and all of that stuff, it would have worked out opposite. Like, that's...
Out of all the factors of it, what, out of all the players, what do you think? I mean, obviously you and Andrea were crucial, right? Like, fundamental, foundational, but like between Trump, Tim
Parlatore.
Yeah.
Different people, Bernie Carrick, like all these different guys that came along and played like crucial roles. Do you see it as like the sum of all?
Oh, for sure, yeah. Andrew and I are different in the sense that, like, we're family, and like we were the only ones. And Andrew and I had this very direct sense, and this is not speaking ill of anybody that helped us out, but like no one bore the consequences like we did. Like if Ed was locked away, we're all locked away. If Ed's in Leavenworth, it's another 2 years of a campaign of my life and Andrea's life getting him out. Like we knew, like there was just no, like Ed going away destroys my mom and destroys my dad. And it's like every day picking up the pieces. And like Ed's life was our life at that point. I'm not behind bars, but I kind of am because it's just us fighting, to do all of that stuff. So there was a different bubble with Andrea and I. Like we always knew that it was a job for them and they might have believed in it and they might have had passion in it, but no one bore it like the family, obviously. But the sum of the parts was, yeah, I mean, dude, having Tim is just another animal. Like, because we dealt with a bunch of lawyers. And like Tim is just not lawyerly. He thinks like a lawyer, he acts like a lawyer, but like he was a blessing. Like to have someone, and that's the whole thing of like you need someone to fight for you, like they're fighting for themselves essentially. Carrick, and some people like really going out of their way to help. But I'll truly say like you could never convince me that Ralph Norman and Duncan Hunter, so these are 2 members of Congress. Ralph's still there. That like I prayed every day, morning, noon, and night for help. And like when Ralph came on board and Duncan was helping, you can't convince me they weren't an answer to a prayer. Like I cannot believe like the amount of Ralph bent over backwards to help. Like this is a member of Congress calling me. I'm not his constituent. I'm not in any way related to his family. Like there's no fathomable reason outside of just personal conviction why he helped us. Like he just saw us on the news and was like, this doesn't seem right. Called, found out about it and was like, wow, this really doesn't seem right. And used a position of power to help. I mean, that man, he's heard me say this story all the time, but like, I was doing the old school way of lobbying for Eddie on the Hill. Like, I would just knock on doors. I would email everybody I could. I met with Democrats, Republicans. I met with everybody. Administration officials. Like, I wouldn't take no. I would go in. It was so laborious because it was like setting up a meeting. Maybe I would get one a day. Maybe I would get a couple a day. Ralph took me to the floor of the House of Representatives, like outside the well. And when members are voting, they all have to be present, right? So it's this old school backslappy kind of environment. And he just would pull people by the lapel and be like, you need to go talk to Sean. And so like, it would be this member of Congress. Like, who are you? I'm like, hey, I'm Sean Gallagher. I'm Eddie Gallagher's brother. Like, you need to hear the story. And like, I would give a 2-minute pitch, hand him a letter and be like, this is a letter we're doing. Like, I need you to look at it. And then I would just like write down the name of who I talked to, follow up with the stat. And like Ralph was just one after the other. And he was just like, you need to hear this guy. You need to hear this guy. And it was all out of like personal conviction and how, so like him mixed with Bernie and all these people who like in just graciousness and goodwill just helped us out.
No other motive.
No, none of them were, there's no compensation for sure. And they just, but all of that together built enough momentum where the strategy really at one point was just like, I need to make it so people can't turn away. You can't turn away. You can't hear about this and not care. And that's why, actually leads me to a question for you. I always thought about this. It was interesting. Our dad, the man in the arena quote that you named your book after.
Yeah.
Dad, when I started working in Congress, gave me a photo frame of it. He really believed in it, and he gave that to you, and that's why I was there. There was one speech that I referenced. Reagan said this along with Bobby Kennedy Jr., and it's always been a quote that I thought was interesting. And I used it all the time when I was talking about your case on the Hill. There's a press conference where Andrea and I are standing with your picture behind us.
Yeah.
Probably saw. And one of these days I was up there and I was railing, I was impassionate, but it's the Bobby Kennedy quote is that moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle.
Oh yeah, I completely agree.
You agree?
Oh,
as someone who's
for
been
sure.
To battle a bunch of times.
Yeah, and I think on my case showed the lack of moral courage by a large. I mean, there were people that completely left us that were like, and these were my friends, my teammates that completely were like, nope, you're by yourself. There was military leaders that knew what was happening was wrong, but they sat there and they're like, I'm not going to say anything. They don't, but they'll go overseas and fight wars, but they don't have the conviction to stand up and do something that they know is right and that they could possibly get flack for, right? That is lacking moral courage.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that is,
I don't want to touch that.
I think that's what's been lacking in our society, but also, in our leaders. Like we don't have any leaders with any moral courage right now. I mean, they're, especially in the military, they're all yes men. All the admirals and generals, dude, none of them will stand up and actually voice what they actually think is right because out of fear of repercussion. So they just go along with the tide, and that is lacking moral courage.
I thought that you'd give that answer. I just think it's like, few people have run into gunfire or like been there, like you have.
You volunteer for it, though.
But there's one thing with like doing it, right? And like to say moral courage is a rarer commodity than someone willing to do that. I mean, really does. I think I knew you were going to say it. It just hits home the point. And for anybody that wants to look it up, like it's in the eulogy of Bobby Kennedy. It's this beautiful, beautiful, like Ted Kennedy gave a eulogy of his brother after he was assassinated. But it was a speech he gave, and it was moral courage is a rare commodity than bravery in battle. Few men are willing to brave the censure of their colleagues and stand up for what's right. And it's something that he reiterated a bunch of times. I said that a bunch because it was clear to me. But of course, like I've never been in combat, so I was just like, but for you, yeah, it just rang true. I mean,
but you also, on the other half, you got to see people with true moral courage.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, there were fewer than the people that weren't standing up, but still, that was a blessing to see. Like people that we talked about, the Akoniacs, Heiner, Beto, like all the people that stood up and were like, nope, this is bullshit, and we don't care what you say about us. We're behind him.
Yeah, it's like I'm wearing the shirt now. This is funny. I wanted to do this on purpose today, right? This is the retro, but like people don't realize when we started, we can't forget to mention the Desir, like Drago and Rachel.
Yep. The Navy SEALs Fund.
Who like when Andrew and I were first 3 weeks, 4 weeks, like we were doing like small, like setting up a website. Like, what do we do? Where do we go? Then Drago and Rachel reached out, and then Beto was like, I'll make a t-shirt to raise some funds. And like, I love wearing this because it's cool and it's new. But like when we were wearing it back then, like that was it. That was our fundraising mechanism. Like Beto made a shirt from his company, and like it's the OG shirt now. It's like I wear it now, and I'm like, oh, people don't. This is when it mattered. This is when we were like, okay, yeah, get this shirt, like get out. And now people are like, I still got it, and it's awesome. People still comment all the time. They're like, I got the OG one. I'm like, heck yeah, it's vintage.
Beto makes some cool shirts.
He does, and that was the other thing too. Like Beto was, him and like it was just like I would visit him, right? Like every couple months, I would fly out from DC to see you in the brig, and like the Akoniacs, Heiner, Aaron, all these other people we mentioned were there. Beto was the only one to get you to laugh, like because it was another team guy who'd been in this shit with you. It's like Eddie would always be like, you just see it. Like I would meet him. And he'd come in, like I tell the story in the book, like first time meeting Eddie, I was so excited to see him because he'd been in the brig for like a month and a half, 2 months or whatever it was. I'm like running in to hug him, and Eddie's just like, fuck this place. Like, he's just sitting there and he's like, God. And I was just like, oh, okay, here we go. And like, I was like, this isn't going to be a touchy-feely, like, hey, it's good to see you. You were like, ugh. And then Beto came in and got you loosened up, and it was just telling stories and ripping with you and all that stuff. And it was necessary. It was important. And those are the memories sometimes I think about now, looking back. I'm like, how gracious and kind and generous it was that they took time out of their day to do that. And like, to me, I start to remember now that speaks, the goodness in those people now speaks more volumes and radiates with me more 5 years.
Yeah, than all the negativity. And that's the thing. I think I reached that point a couple years ago where I'm like, I don't have any feelings about the whole thing. I mean, I'm as far as like resentment, negativity, and all that. Like, there's certain people, like, if I saw them face to face, I'd probably knock their teeth out. But other than that, I don't sit there and think about it and like, oh, it's just it is an experience that happened, and there was a huge blessing. It was a huge victory for our family, and there's a lot of good lessons that came out of it. It changed my life forever. For the better, I think. And, Yeah,
people don't always realize. Andrew said that when you guys were talking to Dr. Chris Free. Like, you'd be in teams right now.
Oh, yeah, I'd still be in.
Yeah. You'd go until your body broke.
Yeah.
That's why I was thinking, again, it's ironic that you're public. Because you were just like, I know what I'm doing. I'm going to be here for 40 years. I'm going to be a gristled old senior master chief, whatever it is. And you'd have just been like gone until like your body shut down. You'd have been 60 years old retiring.
Yeah.
Because that was your passion. Like, that's how much you loved it. Here's
What's cool is though that God loved you so much that He allowed you to go through that stuff.
Yeah.
in order to bring you- Because
Yeah.
your relationship with God, I mean, really, it's blossomed. since
Oh,
then.
big
It's-
time. Yeah. And that was like, that's the overall huge blessing, you know, is just my renewed relationship with Christ through all that. And like, it's just, my eyes were opened, you know, and I wouldn't have any of that without having to go through all that struggle. And I mean, that's life in general. You
Yeah.
know, we took some high school kids football team yesterday down to the range and did like a little beat down sesh for 3 hours. It was a football team, but like gave them a talk afterwards. And that's the main point. I'm like, there's no growth in life without pain. Like you will not be able to grow and become a better person without some suffering and pain involved. And like if you don't have suffering and pain involved in anything and you're just living a comfortable life, then you will not grow. Mm-hmm. You will just stay the same. It takes adversity, you know, in your life to become stronger. And then also once you overcome that adversity, then you are able to serve others by helping them overcome that adversity. And that's, again, the blessing of it. I mean, which is, you know, why we formed the Pipe Hitter Foundation. It's like we could have easily left that and be like, we won, out. But it's like, what good does that do?
Yeah.
You know, it's like if you and Andrea found a pathway to defeat the system.
Are you involved in Pipe Hitter?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's on the board.
Okay, sweet.
Founding member.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's awesome. It actually reminds me a little bit of working in Congress because you take on cases that are really like merit-worthy and righteous, and there's an emotional toll with it. Like Eddie, people don't realize it. Like, dude, vets are reaching out to Ed all the time with, "Hey, I need help," I need all that stuff, and like you can't help but be bogged down by it emotionally sometimes because you're like, man, there's a bunch of people still getting screwed, but that's why the work is so important. Because you know they didn't learn. It's not like they're going to learn. The Navy's going to kick back and be like, "Oh, lesson learned. We're going to do a post." They promoted the dude who got fired from his case. Like,
Well, they handed out awards to the prosecutors
Yeah.
at my case after for losing and cheating. They gave them awards, but then Trump took them away. But
yeah, this
which was
is
awesome.
how. That's the reaction that the military gave, which means that there's the work is yet to be done, and we have a case now where a kid literally got stabbed in the head on base,
Yeah. So
like, and they're trying to prosecute him, and you're just like, in what?
he's breaking up a fight.
Yeah.
And
But this is the Navy system. We just went through it. Like it's a rigged system. They like for this one, they are just charging him to pretty much. It's all to protect the institution. That's all it is. It's like, well, let's just charge all three of them, even though this kid stepped in, did the right thing, tried to de-escalate situation, nearly lost his life for it, and now they're trying to ruin his life and career as
also-
he's laying in bed, like. Barely survived, but that's why our foundation exists. Because then we step in and we're like, nope. But here's the thing: each person that we help has to have the mindset of like, okay, you're good, but you're about to take on the government. So just know that. And there's some people that don't want to do it. They'll give in and like, oh, I'm just going to take a plea deal, and that's their choice. We can't force people to fight. But once you have somebody signed off, like Harrison Tace and his family are like, nope, we're fighting this, and it's like, game on.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Harrison Tace. Yeah, we just announced that campaign yesterday, and hopefully, because it's so like, as many of the cases in the Navy, so ridiculous. I'm hoping that the Navy just drops the charges here soon. Yeah. We'll see.
Is he medical? Like, how's he doing physically? Like, medically?
He's still in critical condition, I think. Still in the hospital.
I mean, if you go to our...
And by the way, the person who stabbed him 8 times is back on the ship working. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, no one...
It's as ridiculous as it sounds.
Yeah.
Like, just go... I encourage anybody. Like, you just go to the Pipe Hitter Instagram page, you'll see a picture of him. The dude got... I mean, it was murder. It was like this dude straight up tried to kill this dude by stabbing him a bunch of times.
8 times he lodged a knife so far into his head, it came through his mouth and was like piercing his tongue.
Yeah. So the picture you
But
can
they're
see,
charging the guy who got stabbed with assault.
Yeah. It's a mixture of
And this is the crazy, like, we put that information out, and this is where people's comments and whatever, and they're like, there's got to be more. This can't be. And it's like, no, this is what happens. Like, there is no more to this story.
That's true, yeah.
Like, that's, people can't wrap their minds around, like, this is how corrupt and broken the UCMJ system is.
Well, I wanted to ask Ed some questions about his thoughts here and perspectives, because I thought,
Here we go.
well, we were talking about this a little last night. I just think your perspective on this will be interesting. So I wanted to give context of our family. And I think most people know this, but so we have 3 grandparents fought in World War II, or what our grandma was a nurse. Our 2 grandfathers were in the Pacific, saw a lot of stuff. Grandpa Ed has his boys, 3 of which are in the service. 1 dies of cancer while he's flying jets. 2 of them go to war. Both Billy and Dad fought in Desert Storm. So that's 2 generations. Dad's child, you're named after your uncle. Mm-hmm. You go to war straight, 20 years. So you have grandpas, sons, grandsons, and now your son is in the Marines. And God knows what's next, right? You have China, Russia, Israel, Palestine. Like, it just seems the next conflict is imminent. Now, I've listened to you talk, and the interesting thing you said, you're just like, look, war is always going to be with us. What don't people understand, given what you've seen? I mean, you were in Iraq and Afghanistan, you went to Kosovo. Now you have a son that's in. Are we not working towards peace as much as we should? Are we relying on it too easily? When you talk to somebody about what it really takes to win and fight and what the reality of that's like, how do you go about it, given you are the 3rd in just our small family who has gone to war straight, and now your son's probably going to go to war, given...
Let's hope not.
Yes, hope not, but that's why I asked the question, is that he will be the 4th, and no one seems to... Like, this country is weird in that no one seems to fight as hard to stop, prevent, deal with it in another way, rather than it's a default decision. And they're sending the Gallagher family 4 generations deep.
Well, the Gallagher family also volunteered.
Yeah, no, and
so
that's part of
let's not say, like, the Gallagher family, and I'd say other generational families, know that when they sign on that dotted line, what they're getting into. It's not like, oh, well, I didn't know you were going to send me to war. It's like, yeah, man, that's why I signed up. Mm-hmm. Like, we're a family of fighters, and I think, especially on the Gallagher side, we have a tendency we will pick an enemy. No matter where we are. We have to have some sort of adversary. And so I think that is one of the reasons. I mean, and we do love this country. Like, I think I said this on a podcast the other day, like, I think the way we were raised is without, being told, is like God, family, country. That's like our values in a nutshell right there. So I think, yeah, it's no surprise to me, like, even though, I mean, it was a little bit that Trevin wanted to join, but he saw the way, that I served in the military. Mm-hmm. He knows our family history.
No, you can't not be
and I don't think that I think America is worn out on war just from being in the past 20 years, like the people are, as they should be, but I think we have a very corrupt leadership. We have corrupt government. It's the military-industrial complex. We'll keep that. It's all about making money, and we let them get away with it. I think who was it? Eisenhower gave that speech and was like, "Beware of this," and it's happening. It's in full effect now. Like, it's weird. It's that military-industrial complex is full steam ahead, and I don't think we're ever going to stop putting our noses in other people's business. It's not because we care. Don't make the mistake. We don't give a shit about Ukraine. Like, the government doesn't care. That's a money-making scheme right there. All that money that we're sending over there, people are outraged about it, like $1.6 million. That money's coming right back to us. That's what people don't understand. It's like we're the ones, we give them the money, and then we sell them the weaponry and get it right back in our pockets, at least in the military-industrial complex's pockets. And I think as long as there's that going on, then yes, war is inevitable. I think we are always going to be on the verge of possibly sending troops over somewhere again, unless if Trump's saying he gets in office, he's going to end it. And I truly and I know people are like, how is he going to end it? He'll do something. He'll do something different than what's going on now. When he was in office, he ended pretty much most of the conflicts. I mean,
or at least didn't start any new ones.
He didn't start any new ones, and he also gave a directive. Like, that was the one key thing when I went into Mosul. He had just become president, and that is the first directive we got in 8 years, where it was like, get the job done, kill them all, and get out of there, right? Before that, anything we got from the Obama administration was like, oh, him and Han, like, stay in place. Don't do too much. We don't want to win. We want to stay in place. And so I think someone like Trump coming in again, and hopefully, he's saying he's going to end a lot of this BS. I do think he has the most chance of doing that. But at the end of the day, man, I'm like, you sign up for the military, that's what you're signing up for. Not to get a free education and, the benefits and this and that. It's like, no, the job you're signing up for when you volunteer for the military is to go fight for this country. Bottom line. So
That's kind of why I asked the question, though, is I think in a lot of senses that's taken for granted, is that people don't realize how precious that is, that it's an all-volunteer force. People like you, your son, our dad, our grandparents, that all do it. I get frustrated because it is taken for granted. They don't realize how precious that is, how lucky we are. And we're too flippant with engaging in conflict and wielding a saber around. That saber is people. It's you. And I don't know. I also get angry at the same people that are morally posturizing about Ukraine or the same people morally posturizing about Iraq. If you were against this, then what are you, you can't be against this. And they give all these lists of reasons. And it seems that it never ends. I think I'm seeing, and this might just be me, but like you and others, podcasting and the community of GWAT vets now are certainly having a new perspective on conflicts. I'm seeing them be a lot more vocal about.
Well, yeah, because we were duped.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask the question is like, all of you have this incredible perspective. You fought 20 years in 2 conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
You saw what the bill of good was that they sold all of us on, and you were there, boots on the ground, doing the work. Now you see some of the same verbiage, the same all that stuff, and I'm starting to see that veteran community, the GWAT community, be like, no, and like they're not bought and sold, and it's not as if someone can tell them, oh well, you're not patriotic or you don't care, and like how dare you and all that stuff, and you're just like, you have no idea how it really works, which is why I think your perspective is interesting, right? Because I'm starting to see a lot of the guys that served that are like, there are diverse opinions. Not saying that there's a monolith, but like, it's interesting to me how your group of veterans now, right? You guys are, the last technical conflict was 2018, 2019. It's 2024 now. Like, you're your own group of veterans. There's going to be a new generation of vets, soldiers going in.
Yeah.
And you guys will have your. How do you see GWAT? Like, now that you're in the line of Vietnam, Korea, World War II, like you're your own cohort. How do you see that? How do you see the boys you serve with expressing their opinions and thoughts and values, ideas about their country and conflicts and all that stuff? What do you?
I mean, I don't speak for the GWAT. I don't speak for anybody else. Everybody else has their own experience and their own opinion. But mine, I'm like, I'm fine with the 20 years that I did. That's what I wanted to do. I feel privileged to be able to do that. Yes, were we duped? Yeah, all that has come out. The way we left Afghanistan was a freaking shame. But at the same time, I knew when I was over there, I saw evil. That is the one thing I can know for sure is I saw pure evil over there, and I was able to eradicate it from this earth. No politics, none of that BS involved, and I got to do it with some of my best friends, right? That is the experience that I had. All the other politics and all the getting duped and all that, it sucks, but I try to not let that like dissuade me from being proud of what we did at all. Like it would be spitting on my teammates' graves who are no longer with us to sit there and be like, well, it was a waste and blah blah blah. No, it wasn't. We got to take evil off this earth, and that's the bottom line. I think going forward, I mean, we'll see, man. I don't at this point. This is the way this country's going. I don't think you can even predict what's next. But I don't dissuade anybody from wanting to sign up and serve. I think it's one of the most honorable things you can do. I think this country is still the greatest country in the world by a long shot. So yeah, I'm glad that there's men and women still wanting to sign up and serve this country because they love it, because they want to protect it. I mean, that's what keeps us going.
Yeah.
We need that. And so to let politics and all this other BS get involved in your decision to serve this country, which I hear from a lot of young kids now, that they're like, nope, I would never serve this country, like not with this administration. That is...
No, it's needed.
It's needed, but here's the thing. I don't blame them because they have all the information on the palm of their hand now, and they can see all the BS that's going on, which is why, when I talk to them, I'm like, that has nothing to do with why you should join, and I've actually gotten like 4 kids to join the military. So, I mean, and I think that what the military is lacking right now is inspiration. Nobody's inspired to join because we have weak leadership to begin with. Like there's no good officers out there anymore at all. Like maybe when they start off, but the officer route is much like the politician route. It's, I started this to do a good thing, and then it's like, well, now I want to climb the ladder, and now I have to push these political decisions down to the men and women, and I don't care what that has the effect on them as long as I get promoted. That's where we're at.
Do you think when Dad graduated West Point, one of the mantras was that the NCOs run the military? Like that was the whole thing. Is it like...
Hell no. NCOs don't run the military.
So that was right. So
NCOs might run CAG, Delta Force. I think they're one of the last ones that have like very NCO heavy like decisions. Other than that, no.
Did that change during your time there in the 20 years you were in?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So that's
during the Obama administration, they poured in way more officers. He pretty much set it up for what we have now. He politicized the military's always been politicized, but he went full force and politicized it, and then got rid of anybody that opposed what he was saying, like a dictator.
Because again, the family history is interesting. If you talk to our dad about his first time in, Dad's a 72 graduate, right? It's Vietnam. It's winding down. He thinks he's going to go to war, but then they end it, so he gets sent to Korea. One of his big things was race relations, right? So he was a second lieutenant, and he had to deal with draftees because all those guys were drafted into a war that then ended. But their thing is like, you don't get sent home. You still have 4 or 5 years of your draft. So Dad always talked about the challenges of like dealing with these guys who did not want to be there. War's over. They don't want to cut their hair. They don't want to show up and muster and do all that stuff. And he's fresh out of West Point, and he's like, our dad is like so by the book. And so he's trying to get these guys in shape, and he talks about the challenges of that. But then a lot of his reflection is working with NCOs because he realized that they were needed. That was instrumental. Like he couldn't just top down say, get it done without being involved with them. Then you served 20, right? This seems to be a big change.
Yeah, I mean, that's how you know when you have a good officer is when he is willing to listen to you as a senior NCO or, whatever your job title is and actually not make decisions without your input. But that's few and far between, especially in the higher rank you get, right? When you're, these officers get to like 04, 05, they're not listening to the master chief. Be like, what do you? They're like, bitch, I'm going to make my decision regardless what you think. So yeah, the NCOs don't have any sway on what's going on. So like that's when people were like, bitching about the military right now and like, dude, it's weak. It's not the NCOs. It's not the enlisted. It's the officers who are making it weak. They're the ones who are making the decisions. They're the ones who are the bad leaders. And there are some decent officers, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, because that's when, people, that's why I thought it was important for you to talk about that. Because I think it's probably one of the bigger changes that's happened, right? Because it used to always be, I think the common understanding was the NCO Corps. That was like the culture, right? Those are the boys. In that set the tone that you couldn't, but anyways. One of the other questions that we talked about last night that I wanted to ask you is, I've been to a lot of Senate and House briefings about the future of warfare and what it looks like, given the conflicts that are going on right now. And so AI and drones, like you talked about being in Mosul, they would try and find you. You'd recce a spot, and you'd look for them to find out where you are. And if they did, you had to move.
Yeah.
And so it's just drones. But now it's like drones everywhere and all of that stuff. I think that there's a misconception or maybe a conception out there that boots on the ground is going to be less and less needed, like a necessity. We'll figure out a technological way. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're going to get to a point where think about it, dude, since the beginning of warfare, back in the day, it was hand-to-hand combat. There's no weapons, like when humans very first started fighting. And then somebody created a club, and then it was like, okay, now I'm going to start fighting with a club. And then it was, now we create swords, and that's still close contact, right? But then it was like bow and arrows, then rifles. And the more we advance in war, the farther the enemies, like your enemy, the distance between you two. And now we've evolved to a point where there's people in frickin' Vegas in a little hut bombing people over in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's the distance now between, you and the enemy. And I think it's just going to keep doing that. I mean, there's always going to be a need for boots on ground, like especially if, to get some intel or whatever to recce a place. But I think as far as striking, dude, the way the drones are being, the advancement in drones right now, it's insane. And it's just going to keep going. I mean, that's the one thing that GWAT did is, especially if you were in the special operations community, we lived in the golden era. It was like we advanced so quickly through the past 20 years, and that's just going to keep going. So yeah, I mean, I do think we should always train to have boots on grounds. That does not mean we should go away from it. Like we should still stick to like the soldiering skills. Like you still need these skills, but I do think that with the advancement of everything, it's going to be few and far between.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about what the next thing is, right?
Yeah, it sucks for them because it's fun.
Well, yeah, those are some of the questions I wanted to ask you. It's awesome to be in the spot, man. It's awesome to be here. It's awesome to be able to talk about this really. I would say the biggest blessing is a boring life. We don't have to we're not in that midst of anything anymore. It's great to be here. It's so surreal in a way, but it's normal now.
Yeah.
That's the best part of it. It's like coming here doing this. I'm like, yeah, come for a weekend.
You get to come down here and relax.
Yeah.
Which is what you should be doing.
Yeah, we say Eddie's worst deployment was when he was stuck on a ship.
My first deployment on a ship. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had PTSD for sure.
That's where your PTSD.
Yeah, that's where it came from. Yeah.
Bro, I always say that one of the funnier stories was we were in Fort Wayne at that time, and Eddie comes home, and I'm still in high school. You joined when I was like 8th grade, 9th grade, something like that. So I'm still in high school. I'm still there. He comes home, and I catch him just sitting we had a pretty big backyard. That was he was just sitting alone on this backyard. And I remember coming out and be like, bro, you all right? And you're like, no. I just need to be out in the open. Because he was in a tight ship for so long. And it wasn't combat, it wasn't anything. He was just like, I don't want to be around people.
Yeah.
And I'm stuck here. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. Let me know if you need anything. And I just went back in. And the dad's like, yeah, I need some time. You need some time to decompress. Like,
yeah. And there was no combat on that deployment whatsoever. Yeah. It was just being on a ship of, crammed in there with hundreds of other people. And
Oh, dude, that story you had
after
with the rack, the people stepping on it when they were stepping in the latrine and like all that stuff.
Oh, dude. So yeah. So this was my first deployment, Dave, and I was a new guy, and I got the bottom rack, which the racks are stacked up. So there'll be like 5 beds stacked up, and you barely have any space. You had to like crawl into your rack, and that's where you sleep. Well, mine was at the bottom, which meant people stepped on my bed to like get up to the top, But the problem was the bathrooms that we had on the ship were overflowing with shit and piss daily. So we had to set up 2x4s in the bathroom so you could balance your way to the sink or balance your way to the toilet, because the ship would rock back and forth and our own shit and piss would just slosh back and forth. And so it would get on your feet, you get on everything, and then guys would come down and step on my bed with their shit and piss feet, which I had to sleep in for 6 months. So yeah, I had a rough deployment, dude. I was like, this sucks, but it is what it is.
Motivation. That's why he was like, I'm out of here.
It gave me perspective for later on. Like it always could be worse.
I was like, I'm not going to be a grunt anymore. I'm going to go do what I need to do. Yeah, that was funny. That was the only time I just saw Eddie. He's out in the middle of like our backyard, just being like,
Yeah.
It's cool, man. Thinking back, like you and me living in Korea and where you are now, the journey that you've been on, all of that is pretty insane. Like, it was neat. Like we had a really unique, really, really uncommon childhood. And I try to explain to my wife and my kids, what it was like. And it's just hard, because you're just like, yeah, our dad drove like a company car, was a Humvee without doors, and we were on a military base, and like you had half Korean kids, half American kids, and we're all like getting together, but like, dad's perspective. And then like, when I was in 2nd grade, dad went to war. He was just like, and that's another story that I think doesn't get told a lot. Like dad was a lieutenant colonel at that point. And he tells this kind of awesome story where like, he was just like, I didn't need to go. Like I could have just sat comfortably where I was. And he's like, this is what I signed up for. And he had that moment. He's like, this is, why am I here but to do this? And like our mom being the like pillar of strength that she has 2 boys. We're on base in Seoul, Korea. Her husband leaves to go to Desert Storm, and we're still on base. And she's like managing us. And back then it was like dad could call us every 4 weeks, 3 weeks, or 2 weeks, whatever it was. And it was like lines connected through Qatar, to get to us. And like they have these wild stories of calling us, and Eddie's out doing something, getting in trouble, and mom has to like hang up the phone. And dad's like, "This is the one time I can call you." Like it's just a unique childhood. And I think that Ed's pretty much a shining star in a long line of military service, that runs through. And that's one thing that's my job really is to put pictures in my home, make sure my kids know about it, make sure they learn about it. But mostly in my mind, it's just like, he's your uncle, right? Like these are regular people, but they did irregular things. I don't know, that's my mentality in it, is not to, like you posted that one thing, I think that a lot of veterans reposted about that comic. Somebody in the crowd was like, what do you think about veterans? And he's like, this country's figured out that it's a lot cheaper to valorize them than to take care of them.
Yeah.
And it was such a like hit and nail on the head. And that's where I get mad, is that like we do such a terrible job. We really do. It can't be understated how.
Well, the government does such a terrible job, but I think the one thing the GWAT veterans have figured out is the government doesn't care about you. In fact, they want you sick. They want you to kill yourself because it's cheaper for them. So I think the GWAT veterans as a whole have come together. There's so many organizations these veteran-funded organizations that help people. Like there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and they're not government-run.
Yeah, some of them are great. Like
Brigade,
that's an awesome one.
And I think that's what we figured out, is we have to stop depending on the government. We have to like stop looking at the government as like somebody that's going to help you. They're not. They don't give a shit about you. And the quicker you can get that through your head, the better off you'll be as an American citizen.
Yeah, I think that your generation for sure. The difference I see is you guys are dealing with mental health differently. You're talking like it's almost like a support community within yourselves, because you're taking it upon yourselves. You're just like, all
it's
right.
shooters taking care of shooters.
Yeah.
And that's how it should be.
Yeah. Because I mean, that's what when I was on the Hill, like I did veterans policy for a really long time, and talk about like that's just anytime you vets, you're just like inundated. World War II, Vietnam, all these people that are just getting screwed, that need help, that the government's letting them down, and like they had the same. Dude, I heard the same thing from World War
It's a
II.
tale as old as time.
Yeah.
It's like it's look back at history. It's
You
like it's
actually-
no different.
Yeah. Do you actually know where the word red tape comes from?
No.
It's Veterans Administration. Abraham Lincoln, after the Civil War ended, in order to prove your veteran status, you had a piece of paper with a red sash tied around it that would be used so that you could submit for benefits. It was backlog, red tape. It's a tale as old as time. That red tape literally emanates from veterans not being able to get the care that they deserved from the Civil War.
But yet we still have people signing up to serve this country,
I know.
which says
That's-
a lot about the American people.
I know. Yeah, you can't give up hope.
No. Just like you said about politics, dude. You have an optimistic view. Speaking of, all right, I got one final question.
Oh no.
Are you going to go back into politics?
My whole focus, like post-trial and all that stuff, was family, right? Like we worked for so hard. I wanted to be a present dad. I wanted to be there. You know, I got 3 boys. They're young. I would love nothing more than to be able to do good. I mean, it's a cesspool. Like I know the reality of it. Like I know the reality of when you run. Like if I ran, you just open like all it is news stories about how horrible you are, right? That's the negative side. I'm willing to stomach that as my wife or my kids. You have to make, it's like a military family, you have to make a decision collectively to be like, is that worth it? I do think it's worth it. I would love to get back in to service in some way. I'm not built, I don't make a lot of money right now. I'm not built, I think, to chase a dollar. Like, I need motivation, and
Yeah.
my motivation.
Purpose.
Yeah, it's purpose. It's purpose-driven life. Like, right now, my purpose is my family. That to me is like the ultimate fulfillment, but clearly in a career, I could see myself doing it again. It really, I mean, and you need it. Like you need good, it's supposed to be a
I think you
citizen,
should.
it's a citizen government thing. Yeah. So,
I think you're built for it. I think you should. You have you always have had a level head, and you get along with anybody, which is where me and you differentiate.
I know. Yeah, that's the difference between us. But,
But that's what makes you're probably one of the best human beings I know, and I
Oh.
think that you would do a phenomenal job up there. But that's your decision. To make.
Yeah, it is. It'll be a privilege if I did, but we'll see.
Well, I'm glad you came out.
Yeah, man.
That we've been going at this for almost 3 hours now, I think. So, but we would definitely have you back on again for
Yeah.
sure in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thanks, guys.
Still not completely convinced y'all are related. I mean, geez, you talk about opposites.
Oh yeah,
I mean, he's so put together and like
I know.
nice.
Hey, what's wrong with you, dude?
I say I set the path for you of what not to do. So
No,
He makes you look really.
Growing up.
We present different, but like when we get together, I will say like there's a commonality. Like I don't know, Eddie and I can sit in silence, and I'm like, this feels like home. Like all the stuff we went through, all the stuff like character, the insights. I'm like, this is someone who thinks like me, believes like me, values like me. I like that. But yeah, personality-wise, we exert a little different. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, guys.
yeah, man, love you, buddy.
Love you.
Thank you. All right.
Oh.